All right. Hi, I'm Ariel Dilamani, and I'm here with Rabbi Maroof. For those of you who don't know, Rabbi Maroof is one of the more prominent rabbis in our community, and he has his online platform, Yeshivat Da'ah Scale, where he uploads amazing shiurim. I personally listen on SoundCloud, and I know that he's eventually opening up a website. They're working on a website right now that's going to have all the stuff on there. Is that it? What do you guys
the
think?
website is currently actually launched already, although it's not super active yet because we're still working out some bugs and things like that. It is actually available online. It's going to have some interactive features. Also, you can log into live classes through the website. You can access all the archive of what's already been done, which is thousands of classes there.
Yeah.
And there's also going to be written content uploaded there, and also an Ask the Rabbi forum for people who want to submit questions and have answers. And we're looking at also a platform for people who are interested in tutoring or other smaller kinds of learning opportunities to create for them, especially nowadays in the COVID-19 or post-COVID-19 world, where many people are more hesitant about attending live classes, or they might be hesitant about sending their kids. So this is an opportunity to continue learning from a distance.
All right. So basically the idea here is going to be, we're just going to discuss different topics in Judaism. And the idea is just to give us enough time to really dive in as deep as we really want, because a lot of times I feel like these topics are brushed over and they're not really explored in their deepest because of time. So I wanted to just be as smooth as possible. We could just discuss certain topics, and I really want to hear what you have to say about all these topics. Honestly, I don't think we're gonna get through much. I think we're gonna probably stick around with one or maybe two of the topics. Basically, the idea for this came actually 8 years ago. I started this class, you could call it, but it was really just discussion between me and high school seniors that were all together on the Israel trip. And we were basically just talking about anything they wanted to talk about. And I realized that it was such a needed space for them, because they were in this transition zone where they were kind of maturing, but they were also not they didn't have the right exposure to different topics, and certain things were taboo. So I really wanted to just give them a private space to talk about anything they wanted to talk about, mostly related to Judaism, but also just in general. And they all had really interesting conversations, and there were a few things that actually stood out. So I want to kind of start with those if possible, and then if we can, if we do this again, we can continue on with those.
Full disclosure to the audience, I have no idea what the topics are.
Yeah.
So if I seem unprepared, I am.
Yeah, he has no idea what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, but that's okay. This sounds just like our conversations at weddings on a broadcast.
Exactly. That's why
whenever we pull each other aside at every life cycle event, we get involved in conversation.
The highlight of every party I go to is that I get to talk to you.
I'm not so sure it's the highlight of your spouse that that we end up disappearing. But.
Unfortunately, she's used to me just rambling with people that I respect. So, all right. So the first topic that I wanted to speak about is a little bit of a loaded one. It's how do we know God exists? This is a question I get all the time, and I just want to make sure that we're going to be very clear about this, and just make the distinction between God's existence and whether or not Judaism is accurate, because I think those two topics get conflated. And also, we should just define our terms, what do we mean by God, if possible?
Okay, so I think that's an excellent question, and I'm glad that you make that distinction, because in my discussions with a lot of people, I find over the years, I've had a lot of conversations, whether dialogues in person or dialogues in writing, with people who are either agnostic or atheist. Yeah. Agnostic means somebody who isn't sure, isn't committed to whether there's a God or not. An atheist means somebody who firmly believes there isn't a God. And in the course of those conversations, the most important work has just been distinguishing between the idea of religion and the idea of God.
Right.
Because most people associate belief in God with belief in the God that's taught in their religion, or belief in a specific tradition or a specific set of dogmas or whatever it might be. And that makes it more challenging for them to believe in God, especially if they come from a religious background where God is pictured in a way that is more cartoonish or seems very unsophisticated. So then in their mind, if they imagine that God is an old man sitting on a throne floating in the heaven, so with a long beard or whatever they're picturing God, so then I always say to them, like, the God that you don't believe in, I also don't believe in. And that's a good conversation starter. And I always go back and I say, let's forget about any particular claims of any religion, and let's just talk about what is the basic idea of God, like you said. And when I talk about, when I think of God, in the simplest way, again, free of anything specifically Jewish or anything related to any faith tradition, so I would say that God means the cause of existence as we know it. Does existence as we know it and experience it have what the philosophers used to call a first cause? And to go back to what's called the first cause argument, which means to try to find, not to make any specific claims about God. Let's say we proceed with the assumption that we don't know anything about God himself or itself. I don't even want to say him, because that already presupposes something. We don't even know anything about God. All we know is, does the universe have a cause? Let's put it that way. Did the universe come into existence as a result of something external to itself? And I think that prior to Einstein, prior to the early 20th century, it was much easier for scientists and for the average person to believe that there wasn't a God, or that there wasn't a first cause of the universe, that the universe was always here, and it just is. But because science advanced and demonstrated that the universe had a beginning, so it became much harder to believe that nothing initiated that beginning. Something initiated the beginning. Now, what that something is external to the existence that we know it, because otherwise it couldn't have caused it to come into existence. We can't really say anything about that cause, because by definition it's something completely external to everything that we experience. Everything that we experience is something that came into existence, or is the result of something that came into existence at a particular point in time billions of years ago.
And is also bound by that time and space.
It's in time and space, and it's subject to the laws of nature that came into effect at that moment, or shortly after that moment, or whatever it might be. Shortly after, meaning like many, many trillionths of a second after, whatever it might be. I don't want to make any scientific claims either, because science is evolving, and exactly what we know, what we don't know, and I don't want to tie our belief in God to any one specific piece of data, because then you'll say, well, the rabbi said it's because the laws of the universe came into existence at such and such time. It's actually not 1/trillionth of a second. It's one quadrillion. I don't know. It's even less than that.
I think it's important to distinguish also between evidence and proofs. Like, I think it's easier to have this conversation whenever you can acknowledge what science gives us is not proof, right? We're not proving that God exists, but there are certain pieces of evidence that come about as science evolves that perhaps point to a first cause, if you will.
Right. So I think the argument is stronger than that. I don't. The term proof has come to mean something mathematical.
Yeah.
And we don't have mathematical proof for anything. I can't give you a mathematical proof of what I had for breakfast this morning. Mathematical proof is only good for mathematics. But what we could say is that what's more reasonable to assume? That the universe came into existence. We know the universe came to existence at a specific point in time. That it came into existence as a result of something or as a result of nothing. And if there was a cause, since we know that everything in the universe that we experience has a cause, effects are always attributed to causes, so it's more reasonable, what we call parsimonious, it's more reasonable and fits with our understanding better to say that the coming into existence of the universe was caused by something. We don't know anything about that something. So if a person says, yeah, but I don't believe God, this, that, I'm not saying anything about what caused the universe. All I'm saying is, number one, it came into existence. That we know. And beyond that, the second aspect of belief in God in a universalistic sort of way is, even if the universe were always here, even if we didn't know, which we happen to have discovered as a result of Einstein really made this contribution, even if we didn't know that the universe came into existence at a certain moment in time, what really intrigues me is the order in the universe.
Yeah.
And where does that come from? And I think that's the reason why many, many scientists, even though they may claim not to believe in God, because to them belief in God means subscribing to a mythological idea of God, but they themselves have a sense that there is some mind behind the laws that they're perceiving, that they see an intelligibility and an intellect behind the laws of the universe that has to come from somewhere. And like Einstein gave the analogy, I know I keep saying Einstein, but just because he's the person who perhaps wrote the most about this, so it's easy to quote him, but he said that when they would ask him about belief in God, first of all, he had a very negative view of atheists because he thought that they were superficial and they didn't understand anything.
He himself was agnostic, right?
He claimed to believe in God very strongly, but in a certain concept of God.
He was like, what's his name? Spinoza.
He said, like, I believe in the God of Spinoza who reveals himself in the laws of nature, right? It's harder to believe in a Spinozan idea of God in the post-Einsteinian era where we believe in the Big Bang, because Spinoza's God presupposed a sort of unity between God and existence and not a beginning in time. So it makes it much harder to believe in Spinoza's God once you have the Big Bang. And that's why Einstein himself, there's actually a book called God and the Philosophers. God and the Astronomers, by a guy named Robert Jastrow. It's a fantastic book, and he talks about science kind of leading to a conviction in the existence of God, and he speaks there about a very famous episode in science where Einstein somebody pointed out, it was actually a student, I think a graduate student or something, that pointed out to him that his equations for relativity would suggest that the universe had a beginning and that the universe was expanding from a beginning point. And he didn't like that, so he tried to solve the equations avoiding that possibility, but he came into it turned out that somebody found that he made an error in the math. He divided by 0 at a certain point in his calculations. So much was he opposed to the idea of a supernatural creation. In other words, he wanted to believe in a God in the sense of a mind behind the universe, but he didn't want to believe in a God that was supernaturally created the universe from nothing, even though his own scientific discovery pointed to that idea. So to me, putting the Big Bang aside, because you don't need that, but just the order and the design in creation, and I'm not talking about biology, because biology is very complicated, and maybe one day we can talk about evolution versus creation. I don't even want to get into that right now, because that's a distraction, although we can talk about that for a long time. But forgetting about evolution versus that type of design, forgetting about teleology, meaning that there is a purpose to organisms, or that things serve a function. So evolution actually provides biologists with the ability to talk about purpose in organisms without having to refer to a creator, because we can see very clearly that cells serve a function in the body, that organs serve a function in the body, but function implies purpose, and purpose implies mind, and that's very bad. So once you bring in the construct of evolution, and I'm not saying evolution true or false, let's save that for another discussion, but a Jew should, in my opinion, maybe this is heretical, but we're allowed to say whatever we want on this, right? Maybe it's heretical, but I don't think any scientific theory should be incompatible with Judaism, and I don't think that it is incompatible with Judaism. In fact, if anything, the idea that the creator of the universe could produce such a variety of living things on earth with one act of creation from which everything else sprung naturally without any other divine intervention, it to me is a greater miracle than the idea that God created each species individually. But that's myself. Seeing the order in nature, meaning the scientific law in nature, to me, is what points to a mind behind it. There's a book called Fearful Symmetry, also by a scientist, by a physicist, and he refers to God throughout the whole thing. And in the epilogue, he says, you might have thought it strange. I refer to God. I call him the designer with a capital D. He's like, listen, I believe that there's obviously a mind behind the universe. He's not a religious person. He's like, and I think most scientists do, and most mathematicians actually believe in, they say that of all of the areas of scientific thought, the one in which there is the most belief in God is in mathematics. And I think the reason for that is because mathematicians are used to thinking about abstract objects as real. And so the idea of a creator who is abstract, that you can't see and touch and feel, it can be real to them. Whereas a lot of scientists become more materialistic. They look at only physical things that you can measure. And since you can't measure God and you can't fit him into any pre-existing category, it's harder to relate to him. But that's another thing. In terms of, to me, the laws of nature are the thing that point the most to the existence of a mind behind nature. And years ago, I think I might have mentioned this to you one time in one of our conversations, I can't remember. I had a dialogue with somebody by email. This guy was commented on a blog of a friend of mine, and was upset that this friend who's quoted Richard Feynman in some blog of a Devar Torah. And he said, Richard Feynman didn't believe in God, and he, why are you bringing him into religion? He was against religion and all that. He was very upset. And so he and I started having a dialogue by email. And I kept responding. He kept attacking religion, and I just kept responding to him sort of with the approach to the idea of God that I'm saying now. And after many exchanges where he was very aggressive, at a certain point his tone changed, and he's like, you accomplished something that many rabbis have tried to do over the past decades. He was Jewish, and nobody ever succeeded, which was to get me to discuss religion in an intelligent way. And I see that what we are trying to do is very similar. We're both trying to educate people. We're both trying to get them away from superstition, away from primitive thinking, towards more enlightened thinking. I see that we're really doing the same thing. And I'm really grateful for this, that we had this dialogue. And I was BCCing the guy of the original blog on all of these exchanges. And after he saw that email, he said, he said, I would have stopped talking to the guy after 2 emails. How did you keep going? Why did you keep going until that point? And I said, well, I didn't know for sure that I would be able to bring him around. But what I knew that there was a possibility that he would come around. How did I know? I knew because another friend of mine years ago told me a story. He was a Russian immigrant. And when the Russian immigrants came here, Jewish Russian immigrants, so they had these Russian yeshivot that would say, really in Russia they had no religion. It was communism.
Yeah.
So they would say to them, we'll teach your children English. Just let them come to this religious school. So these rabbis are trying to get them to learn Judaism, and teaching them English. I'm sure they taught them English too, judging from the fact this guy spoke English pretty well. And so I guess it worked. But he told me a story. He said when he was in this yeshiva, he said most of the kids didn't care about religion. They couldn't care less about religion. They were indoctrinated to hate religion. At the end, so when they would go to the religion classes, they would listen. They would, take notes. They would pass the test, and they didn't care about it. He said there were 2 kids that would argue with the rabbi about everything. Everyone else just kept quiet. They would argue with the rabbi on every point. They would debate the rabbi on every point. He said those 2 kids became religious. He was one of them.
Wow.
Those 2 kids. Why? Because they cared about it.
Yeah.
They cared enough to argue. So I said the fact that he kept debating back and forth meant he cared enough to argue. It was important to him deep down. And the postscript to that story was, I had never been on Facebook. My wife made me a Facebook account. I never wanted to go on it. I said, it's a fad. We're talking about, this was like 10, 12 years ago. The first request I got was from that guy, from that scientist, who happened to be like a student of Richard Feynman himself. And when I got the request, I said, now I have to actually go on Facebook and accept it, because I don't want him to feel that I didn't respect him after all of that exchange, that back and forth. But I've had almost the same exchange with many people who consider themselves atheists, but the reason they consider themselves atheists is because they think that to believe in God is to believe in a kind of a fairy tale, Zeus-looking or old man in the sky-looking God, when Judaism's idea of God is so close to the scientific idea of God that I'm saying, because we always say you can't understand what Hashem is, you can't understand what God is, you can't comprehend Him in any way, and anything we say is just a metaphor. We can describe what happens in the world and say that is the act of God, but we never really understand God Himself, and that's exactly what I'm saying to you. There's something that caused the universe, something that put the order in to the things that we see and experience, and it's really magnificent, and it follows these really precise formulas that even after hundreds or thousands of years, we're barely figuring out the code behind it. That's behind it, and that's God's handiwork. What is the mind like? Like Einstein said, studying the universe is like walking into a library full of old books written in a language that you don't understand. Right? He said you don't know who wrote the books or who put them there, but you know somebody did. He said that's what it's like. You're trying to decipher this code. You know somebody wrote it. Some mind wrote it. And to me, that's where a sense of God, awareness of God and belief in God is unshakable to me, no matter what your religious beliefs are. In Judaism, we use events of Jewish history to bolster our belief in God, like the Exodus from Egypt or the revelation at Mount Sinai, and things that happened to our ancestors that convinced them of the existence of God on an experiential level. But on an intellectual, individual level, I think that the universe speaks for itself, and that's why even in the prayers that we say in the morning, when you say the blessings before the Shema, the first one is a whole long description of the creation, because that's your number one demonstration of God's existence. And then, of course, there's the Exodus from Egypt, which is our historical evidence for God's existence. But that's something that a person can accept the testimony, or can be maybe question it or feel less comfortable accepting it. But I don't see how somebody can look at a universe that's so intricately designed and that started from a beginning, that we know that it started from a beginning, even without that, so intricately designed and organized, and think it happened by accident. It just seems a lot less reasonable. Again, you want to use the term proof, but a lot less reasonable to believe that than to believe that something is behind, a mind is behind it.
I think one of the arguments I hear like frequently in order to deal with the issue of order, right, seeing order in the universe, is the multiverse theory, right? Are you familiar with multiverse?
Yeah.
So what would you say to people who are like, oh, well, it's just there's just an infinite amount of universes, and we happen to live in one that happens to be orderly, but there's many other universes out there that are not orderly and have no capability for life, and they're just complete chaos. And the math works out that, like, statistically, one of these is going to fall out to be good.
Well, there's a couple of answers to that. The first one is that there's absolutely zero. We have ample evidence that our universe is organized according to really precise laws, but we have zero evidence that another universe exists, let alone an infinite number of universes exist, which itself would beg the question of where did they come from if they had a beginning like ours did, which is a whole other separate question. So you're making up. The problem with the multiverse theory is that it is what we call an ad hoc theory. It is a theory created specifically to avoid the idea that there's a God. It's not a theory that's created to explain anything. In other words, it's just it's positing the existence of an infinite number of universes because so compelling is the evidence from our universe. And in fact, it's almost like the Gemara uses a language, v'hi notenet, meaning it gives strength to the other side of the argument. It's that the intelligibility and organization of our universe and the order is so compellingly obvious that it comes from a mind that the only way I could get around that is to imagine the ridiculous sci-fi idea that there's an infinite number of universes and this is just statistically the only one that's organized, as if even with an infinite number of universes, why would one of them be perfectly aligned with scientific law? Why wouldn't it be instead that each one was a little bit organized and a little bit chaotic? That sounds like a lot more what if you just threw blotches of an infinite number of blotches of paint on all kinds of different surfaces. So on one surface, like some of the blotches might turn out to look like a flower, and some of them might turn out to look like a balloon. Most of the blotches would just be whatever. But there wouldn't be one that turned out to be a masterpiece and the rest of them just looked like whatever. That wouldn't happen. So it's even if you did it infinitely, you would never, you can't prove, you're assuming, you're making an assumption that one of them would somehow turn out to be a masterpiece. But why is that the case? An infinite amount of random things doesn't produce a masterpiece.
Yeah, I also think like that,
But it's also the theory itself is literally created just to avoid the implication of the existence of God. It doesn't have any evidence for it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a big point.
So we have a principle of Occam's razor. What is Occam's razor in philosophy or in thought?
I'm not familiar with that.
So Occam's razor means you take the fewest assumptions. Whenever you want to explain something, you make the fewest assumptions. Because the more assumptions you're making, the shakier your explanation is. So I'm going to assume that I'm going to assume that there's an infinite number of universes, even though nobody's ever seen any evidence of that, and the idea of infinity itself is really problematic. And then I'm going to assume that randomly distributed among all of them is a certain amount of order, or a certain amount of order or non-order, and I'm going to assume that in one of them it will turn out that it's perfectly aligned with order. It's like making all these assumptions and then saying, and then it happens to be this is the one that we're in. So and that everything else happened as a result of that. So that's making a lot of assumptions instead of just saying I see something intelligent, designed and organized in an intelligent way. I assume there's a mind behind it. That's all I'm assuming. I'm not assuming anything else about the mind. I'm not assuming that you have to believe in any religious tenets. I'm just saying that the simple Occam's razor, meaning cutting away all the extra assumptions, is I look at the universe in front of me. It's organized. There's an order to it, and I can see that. And it's the basis of all science is assuming that the universe is organized. Otherwise, there's no point in studying science.
Exactly.
You're studying science because you believe that cause and effect predominate, and that there is an answer to a question. In the universe of the primitive, let's say, polytheistic nations, there was no science. Why? Because this thing that happened is because of the wind god, and this thing that happened is because of the ocean god, and this thing is because of the cloud god, and that's because of this little god of love caused that, and the other god did that. The god of war makes people aggressive. So you don't have any unified explanation of anything because everything is random and chaotic in that view. Once you introduce the idea that there's one God, and again, without saying what that God means, it could be the God of Aristotle, it could be the God of Plato, okay? One cause of everything, so then it makes sense to say, well, then that means everything is designed by one mind and fits together. So how does it fit together? And then you end up having systems of thought like Aristotle's, who tried to interconnect the workings of everything. Now, did he do a perfect job? Obviously not, but he was obviously a genius who was the founder of almost every discipline. He was literally the founder of almost every intellectual discipline, and also happened to be one of the first people in the general world, in Western culture, to come up with the idea that there's one God, one cause. He called it the first cause, or the prime mover is the term that they used. The first mover, meaning the thing that initiated all the other motion that you see. Even though he believed in eternity of the universe, he didn't believe in creation. But he believed that there was an order that was, and the order and the motions that you see are caused by a first cause. So that's, and you see that that's why the Western world was the home of science, because once you believe in one God and everything everything has to make sense now. Everything has to fit together now. And I think Rabbi Slifkin in his book, which I only skimmed very quickly years ago, but The Challenge of Creation, has like a bunch of great selections from different books about this, that the idea of God, of monotheism, underlies science, because it gives you the conviction that everything has to make sense and that everything's rational and orderly at some level. You see it in the Tanakh. That was one of the things that, you'll hear scientists, even like Carl Sagan, who was Jewish, and even Richard Feynman, who was, these were nominally Jewish scientists, and let alone other scientists too, say, the ancient Hebrews didn't have an idea of, the idea of scientific law originated with the Greeks, but it's not true. There are psukim, many psukim in the Tanakh that talk about it. In Mishlei, it's full of psukim that talk about how the universe was designed with wisdom. In Tehillim, it's full of it. Famous pasuk, Im lo briti omam v'layla chukot shamayim v'aretz lo samti. The laws of heaven and earth, the idea of law being that there is cause and effect and there's order in the universe, originated with the idea of belief in one God, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Also, what interests me also is that in certain texts it's very specific. Like, for example, in Alenu, it says right? That is like stretching out, like stretching out or unfolding.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Or I think there's also in I forgot the name. We say before Rosh Chodesh, on Rosh Chodesh, like Berich. How did I forget this? You know what I'm talking about? The Arvit of Rosh Chodesh.
Oh, and Baruch Nafshi. Right,
sure. Right. He unfolds like a curtain. Right. Like, those are very specific terms to expansion of universe.
Yeah, Rabbi Biton talked about it a lot in his book. I thought his book was really interesting. I actually wanted to reread it because I read it quickly, and then I wanted to go back and read it again because he had a lot of really great tidbits of connecting biblical ideas with scientific ideas.
Yeah.
And the Rambam, was one of the Rishonim, the early commentaries, in the medieval period and even before that, did this a lot. They tried to connect the specific descriptions in the Tanakh with scientific concepts, and I think that's really helpful in every generation to do that. And Rabbi Hirsch tried to do that for, let's say, 19th century science. In every generation, you have rabbis who take the Tanakh and try to interpret the terms in terms of scientific constructs that we have today. I'm not as inclined to do that. Like, there was also a book called Genesis and the Big Bang by Gerald Schroeder, who's a wonderful person. I think he's still alive.
Yeah.
Right? He
still does his classes.
Yeah, and Aish Torah, I think, right? Yeah, he's a very respected person and did great work. But I personally lean a little bit more in the direction of actually Rabbi Slifkin on this, that even though I know that this is a big issue of debate and some rabbis will really not like this, maybe even my own friend Rabbi Biton, we might have to debate it one time. Might be interesting conversation.
That'd be very interesting, honestly.
I don't know. He would probably beat me in a debate. I'm sure because he wrote an entire book on this and he's very knowledgeable about it. But my inclination is more in Rabbi Slifkin's direction, even though on many things I disagree with him strongly. But on this, I happen to feel that the approach to Tanakh should be a philosophical approach as opposed to a scientific approach, meaning I am wary of attempts to tie words and terms and phrases in the Tanakh to specific scientific ideas because number one, science is evolving, and the problem is that when we do that, we make our religious understanding, we predicate our religious understanding on a specific scientific beliefs. Scientific, I don't want to say beliefs because that's belittling science, but scientific consensus or whatever the scientific approach is of that time, and in so doing, we also might limit our exploration
Yeah.
of science, because then a person says, well, I can't discover that the Big Bang didn't occur because my Judaism or my belief in God is now predicated on Bereshit, meaning that the universe had a beginning. Whereas even the Rambam, who believed that the universe had a beginning, wanted to make very clear that were it to be proven that the universe didn't have a beginning, that would be just fine with him, and he would be able to interpret the Tanakh accordingly. And he says in a very famous passage in Moreh Nevuchim that there are more passages in the Tanakh that sound like God has a body than there are that say that God created the universe from nothing, and we had no problem interpreting them in a metaphoric way. Why should we have a problem interpreting these phrases in a metaphoric way? Now, at the end, he actually really takes issue with Aristotle and believes that, in fact, there's no reason to conclude definitively that the universe is eternal, and that Aristotle confused a theory of his own with fact. But he also wanted to make clear that doesn't mean that we believe that were some scientific idea to be proven, that would undermine Judaism, because right. and that's important too.
Would it be all right to say that as science stands right now, like in order to interpret certain ideas that we might have had, not to say that the Torah isn't true because of them, but to say that as science progresses and we understand more things about the universe, that this is perhaps the way that what it's talking about, meaning not to say definitively, because I think science does constantly evolve, and it's just dependent on research and what we're able to observe in the universe, and that will be changing as technology progresses. But at a certain point in time, like for example, after the Hubble telescope, where you know that the universe is not static and it's expanding, and then you see a pasuk like Anoteh Shamayim Ka'iriyah or something like that, you can perhaps say, oh, maybe this is what it was talking about. I don't know who wrote
David HaMelech.
Yeah, it was David HaMelech. It's
right.
Okay.
So I'm not saying you can't do that. It might be helpful to do that sometimes, especially with a text like Bereshit, and what is the Rakia, and what is the Or V'choshech. Doing that in Tehillim, to me, and again, I know that Rabbi Biton did that, so I'm not. It's not like saying that he did something wrong. Right. I think he did what the classical commentaries always did. They always tried to interpret the text in accordance with their understanding. And the Rambam and the Moreh Nevuchim is trying to interpret, Or V'choshech, and the Choshech means this one of the four elements. He was using Aristotelian physics, and that's the tradition to do that. But I'm saying, especially in Tehillim, but even in Bereshit, I feel like there's nothing wrong with interpreting it and correlating between it and scientific ideas. But to think that David HaMelech knew about the Big Bang is kind of a stretch. Oh, no pun intended. That he knew about the expansion of the universe, whereas the simple reading is that it's a poetry. It's poetry. You know what I'm saying?
But also these things were written with Ruach HaKodesh, right? So you could say that maybe he didn't know exactly what he meant, and he was just looking at, poetically, he was writing it. And
he was inspired to use a metaphor that happened to contain a nugget of scientific
I don't know
truth.
that that's necessarily true. I'm just proposing.
It's not necessarily. Yeah, it's not necessarily not true.
Yeah.
I wouldn't object to that idea.
You just think it's unnecessary.
I just think it's unnecessary. Yeah. Exactly. I'm saying either way. So then, then they prove that the universe isn't expanding. Okay, so it was just a metaphor.
Yeah.
So it's like when it says. Oftentimes, Rabbi Chaim will point out that a lot of the language of the Tanakh, a lot of language of even the Tefillot is based on cosmology that today we wouldn't agree with, like Chalonei Rakia. Habokea. The Hashem opens the Chalonei Rakia, the windows of the firmament, and they believe that the sun went through a window and went out the other. Or they believe that the sun went around the earth, or they believe that there were windows that were opening. Now I read that and I say it's poetry.
Yeah.
It's just poetry. I don't have to say, they had the science wrong. Okay, it could be that they did, but I don't interpret it that way. Just like today, I'll say, what time is sunrise? Even though I know the sun isn't rising, the earth turning. Okay, well, we still call it sunrise and sunset, even though, And so it's like it's poetic language being overinterpreted, maybe, to my mind. Whereas the basic ideas of the creation don't need to be correlated with specific scientific understandings, and it might be overkill to think that, to take, because since the problem with it, I guess, is to me, and again, I'm not knocking anyone who does it, but the problem with it is to me is that if I can interpret something either way, then I'm not really interpreting it at all. Meaning, if I could say Noteh Shamayim Kari'ah means expansion of the universe, but if you prove that there was no expansion of the universe, I'll just say it was a poetry. It was a metaphor. So then I'm not really reading the text. I'm just saying I have a certain idea.
Right.
I see Noteh Shamayim Kari'ah in there. So if it works, beautiful, it works. If it doesn't work, then I'll just say it's poetry. There happen to be a lot more examples that Rabbi Biton brought in his book that were very persuasive and convincing, and I really like them, but I can't remember them right now because I didn't review. I read the book a long time, like a year ago. But there were a lot of examples he brought that really, and the way he tied in the science was amazing in his book, and it was very compelling. I liked it a lot, but I always get worried that if we wed our reading of that we have two things can happen. We can either limit our scientific exploration, or we can limit our reading of the text. Or we can fool ourselves into thinking we're reading the text when really we're just reading into the text ideas that we already had before. And then we're not really learning from the text. We're just trying to rehabilitate it. And that comes, in my opinion, from a lack of actual belief. Because a person is afraid. See, I don't have any fear that I'm going to find out that the Torah is not true. I don't have any fear of that. So therefore, whatever science brings to me, I look at it and I say, okay. But if a person's afraid that, if I find out that such and such written in the Torah doesn't correspond to science, what do I do now? I'm perplexed. That's because they think it might be possible that maybe the Torah isn't really true, right, and something's going to come that's going to convince them of that. I don't have that fear. You could compare it to a person, like if you go to somebody and say, what if, I'm not comparing myself to any great person, but if you were to go to a scientist and say to them, what if I prove to you physics isn't real, it's made up? Mm-hmm. They would say, that's absurd. But what I could show you some things that don't fit with what you understand in physics, and I will prove to you physics is not real. Even if you show me something I don't understand, that doesn't mean I'm going to decide that the system is not real.
Right, and I think that's the distinction. Like, just because we were wrong about the way to interpret a certain text doesn't make the text inaccurate.
Right.
It's limited to our knowledge of the time. It's not. It doesn't make people 1,000 years ago wrong because they read certain texts and it didn't jive with today's understanding of science. They were limited by their time. That didn't ground their Judaism. It was just, okay, fine. There's certain science of the time. And this is the framework through which we might understand the Torah better by the science of our time.
They had a much more fluid understanding of interpretation of text than we do, What do you mean? Also, meaning Midrash, you see from the way that Midrash interprets text, that it's much more open-minded. It's much less wedded to the literal meaning of the text.
But that's the style of the Midrash.
Right. But it's definitely not fundamentalist reading of the text, that's for sure.
But its purpose isn't to tell you a literal truth, if I understand correctly.
Sometimes it might be, right. But the understanding, see, the Torah is eternal, but our understanding is evolving. Which means that...
Yeah, of course.
Right, which means that there's something like, just like a scientist 100 years ago, whether it be Einstein or Niels Bohr or whoever you want to, I keep mentioning Einstein just because he's the best example of a 20th century scientist that everybody knows that made fundamental discoveries. Isaac Newton, whoever, might have discovered certain things that we today, 100 years later, because it was in the 1920s that Einstein was really publishing his ideas. So 100 years later, we understand more implications of Einstein's theories than he himself would have understood, and more applications than he himself would have understood. And if he were to come into the 2020 and see all the technology that we have today that fundamentally is really rooted in the discoveries that he made 100 years ago, he would not know what an iPhone was or what computers were or anything like that. But if you patiently explained to him over a couple of sessions how his discoveries led to certain developments in technology and that this iPhone is because of Einstein, he would be able to understand it. So So the original discovery is unpacked and developed by subsequent generations, so our understanding is evolving. That's why there's a midrash, not a midrash, a story in Masechet Menachot, very famous story about Moshe Rabbeinu. There's a very famous story of Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moshe Rabbeinu came to Hashem and he sees Hashem putting the crowns of the letters, right? It's a famous story.
Yeah.
And he asks Moshe Rabbeinu asks Hashem, what are you wasting your time writing crowns? He said, one day there's going to be a person named Akiva who's going to interpret every one of these little dots as many, many profound ideas. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, I want to see this person. So Moshe Rabbeinu goes into class. And Moshe Rabbeinu is sitting in the back of the class listening to Rabbi Akiva give a lecture. He has no clue what's going on. No clue what Rabbi Akiva is talking about. Moshe Rabbeinu, who's the Adon HaNevi'im, master of everything, has no clue what Rabbi Akiva is talking about. Finally, Rabbi Akiva comes to a certain point and says, this is a halacha le-Moshe Misinai. And then it says, now Moshe Rabbeinu understood. Now what does it mean? It's the same thing, lahavdil, but once he saw, all of these derivations and 100 steps removed from what I taught, but once I see the 100 logical steps from what I taught, I see, it does really essentially go back to what I taught them. I didn't see it right away, but once you show me the path that idea led to one step and another step and a third step and 100th step, I see how the current application to this case really derives from an idea that was thousands of years before. And so, of course, the story goes that Moshe Rabbeinu says, why did you pick me to receive the Torah? Why didn't you pick this guy? He's a bigger genius. That's the end of that. There's a whole postscript to the story that he sees what happened to Rabbi Akiva was terrible and all that. But that's an aside to the reason I'm mentioning the story is just that the originator, meaning the one who received the Torah from his own prophecy, didn't see all of the evolution of understanding that was going to come after it.
Yeah.
He didn't. And so that's why they have all these 13 principles of deriving halachot and clarifying things, because we have to have an ongoing process of unpacking the ideas. You don't even have to go back thousands of years. Go back to the Declaration of Independence. It says, we believe that all men are created equal, but those same people had slaves.
Yeah.
The same people that wrote, we believe that all men are created equal and are given by God inalienable rights, were owning slaves and doing all this, and didn't allow women to vote. And they didn't see any, doesn't it say, unless they took men very literally, I think it means all humans are created equal, including their wives and their slaves. So how did that work? And yet it took a couple of 100 years for our society to realize that there was a conflict between our practice and the actual concept that that was written in that document. That even the original writers of the document didn't see the conflict between those two ideas. Now, I'm not saying there's anything like that in the Torah. Obviously, there's no conflict. Moshe Rabbeinu wouldn't have had an idea opposed to the Torah. But just saying that a document can be very wonderful, an inspired document, a document that comes from real inspiration and insight, and yet the people afterwards, it can take generations for them to absorb and evolve in their understanding of the nuggets that are hidden in the document. And that's what we do to today. So
that's what I'm saying, though. It doesn't really matter that our interpretation. I think we have to start thinking.
How much battery you have on your phone?
I charged it before.
Oh, you did?
I'm praying that this is recording, by the way, because I can't see from this.
Oh, it doesn't give you a light or anything?
No.
You want to check?
That would have been smart.
Yeah.
No, whatever. I'm recording from here anyways. So,
you are too? Okay, good. I was going to say, I hope we have a backup.
I just wanted a backup. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's good, just in case.
Since
you can't see our faces anyway with a mask.
Yeah, it doesn't matter anyways. Yeah. But I think we have to start, like, when we approach topics, we have to get in the habit. I'm speaking to myself because I think a lot of times we're very much attached to the way that we understood this is equal to what it's actually saying, or what the truth of the text is. Mm-hmm. Just because our understanding of the Torah might change over time doesn't necessarily mean that the Torah itself isn't true. Those are distinct things. I know we're not really talking about Torah. I guess we kind of evolved into this topic, but I think there's the understanding of human beings at a certain time, and there's the truth of the text.
Mm-hmm. The text is something independent of us.
Right, exactly.
And our understanding, and part of the idea of Torah Sheba'al Peh, that we have a written Torah and we have an oral tradition, is that ideally this understanding would be transmitted orally in a continual process from generation to generation. It ends up being also now learned from texts. But even now that it's learned from texts, you still have a teacher, you still have explanation, you still have back and forth, you still have engagement. There's no real learning that takes place without human engagement and human interaction and discussion. At the end of the day, this is like another story in the Talmud about Rabbi Akiva. It's about Hillel. Another story about Hillel where the convert comes, and there's 3 converts in the story, but I'll just say the one that is relevant to this. So the convert comes and says, I just want to learn the written Torah and not learn the oral Torah. And I want to convert. And so Shammai, of course, says, get out of here. Hillel says, sure, no problem, because he's very agreeable. And so he says, okay, but now we have to learn. So I'm only going to teach you the written Torah. Okay, so he shows up the first day of class, and Rabbi Akiva shows him, let's say, 5 letters on the board. Okay, I have to learn Hebrew. That's the beginning. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey. He gives him letters. He says, now go home, practice homework. Come back next week, or however, I don't know when it was, how often the classes were. He goes, he practices, Abba, all the things that we learned when we were kids to learn Hebrew. Abba, Gada. He comes back, and Rabbi Akiva puts the same 5 letters, and he says, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yud. He says, what do you mean, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yud? I just spent the last week studying this Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey. I'm dramatizing the story a little bit, because it doesn't say what the letters were. But he showed him the same letters, told him something else. Oh. So it said, right? So he says, what do you mean? You told me those same letters, that was Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey. Now you tell me it's Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yud. How could it be? He said, if you're going to believe me about the letters, right, how do you know language? How do you know that the way that we're reading these letters is correct? Because somebody taught you orally, right? In fact, you can't learn a language if there was no living speaker of the language and no recording. Now we have recordings. You would not be able to learn a language because all it is characters.
Spoken language, not
even a written language. Meaning, how did they discover how to decipher, let's say, Egyptian hieroglyphs from that thing, the Rosetta Stone that they found? Right, that's what the Rosetta Stone was.
Really?
The original Rosetta Stone was a stone that had written on it the same text in, I think, 4 different languages, but I might be wrong. It might be more. A number of different ancient languages that they had never been able to decode, but they knew one of them. So they were able then to figure out all the other languages. That's why it's called the Rosetta Stone, and that's why the company, this is not a sponsored video, but maybe we should get a sponsorship from Rosetta Stone now, but that's why the company that teaches languages is called Rosetta Stone.
Wow.
Right? So they were unable to understand those languages until they had some translation from one language to the other, because otherwise it's just letters on a page. How are you going to know what it means? So Hillel said to the guy, I told you what these letters are. You're trusting me for that. So when I tell you what the meaning of the words is, if I tell you the meaning of a word, if I teach you the meaning of a concept, you should also trust me. Meaning, it's just like language is a living tradition. Our understanding of the text is a living tradition. It's not. You can't access the written Torah without some kind of an interpretive framework that comes from outside the text, and that's true of any text. Because if you take a text like, I don't know, Gulliver's Travels, or any book that was written in a certain place and time, Animal Farm, almost everyone's read Animal Farm. Why do we understand Animal Farm? Because we know what 20th century communism was and all of that. So when you read Animal Farm, you realize it's a metaphor for communism. Give the same story to a kid who has no historical knowledge and no background. It's just going to be a story about a bunch of animals on a farm, bothering each other. It's not going to be, they're not going to get the message of it because they don't have the context. You can't really understand without a context what the text is talking about. Even if you understand the words, you won't understand the real meaning. And it's true of much of literature. A lot of literature is like social commentary or philosophical commentary or political commentary. And if you don't have the context, you're not going to get that.
And it's not just literature. I mean, to take it back to Judaism, I wanted to separate the two,
sorry,
but no, but it's good. It was the next topic, anyways. But it's also like a lot of mitzvot that we have in the Torah, you wouldn't know how exactly to perform them without the oral tradition.
That's a practical thing, yeah.
Most notably tefillin. How do we know there's 4 parshiot.
There's many things. How do you know what a sukkah is? How do you know what many of the things are? Or the one that I used to be visited on a regular basis by some Jehovah's Witnesses in Wisconsin, I used to tell you. And one of the things that they have is they're very against the idea of the oral tradition, because they feel that that's what holds Jews back from accepting their ideas. And one of the things that I tried to show them was the oral tradition. And so I showed them examples of it. And one of the examples, I gave them a couple of examples, and actually I kind of got their back against the wall a little bit, but I gave them, I'll skip some of the examples that I gave because they might be more complicated, but I'll give a simple one. That I said to them, I showed them the pasuk. One verse in the Torah says that when there's a case in court, and they find who is innocent and who is guilty, and it says, "Vaya im bin hakot rasha," it shall be if the one who is guilty is worthy of lashes, v'ipilo hashofet v'yikahu lefanav kedei yushador b'misparo. So then the judge should lay him down and give him the lashes, okay, by number. Arba'im yakenu lo yosef, up to 40, which we actually only give 39 because we don't want to go over. But the point is, I asked them, who is worthy of lashes? Who? It says v'haya im bin hakot rasha. It shall be if the person is worthy of lashes. Who is worthy of lashes? They said, well, it must say somewhere else in the Torah who's worthy of lashes. It doesn't. I read the Torah a couple times. I looked for it. It doesn't say it. So can you show me who's worthy of lashes? Because it doesn't say, but it now you're telling me that following the oral tradition is following the religion of men created by human beings, oral tradition, and not following the religion of God. Okay, I only want to follow the religion of God. Where in the Torah does it tell me who is going to be subject to lashes? Because otherwise the judge is going to make his own decision, and I'm going to end up following the opinions of a human being and not the opinion of God. And what did they say to me? They said, oh, well, there must have been other books that told you who is worthy of lashes, or what the laws, what the work is on Shabbat that you're not allowed to do, or any of the other things that I showed them. And they said there must have been other books that had this information. I'm like, exactly, that's called the Talmud. It's just that we didn't write it down till later. We kept it oral in the beginning. We wrote it down. So I'm glad we agree on that. But that's exactly your point. You can't understand it without it.
Yeah, I guess that transitions us like pretty well. It's already there, basically. How do we know the Torah is true, and why should we keep it? Right, distinct from whether or not God exists, right? We believe that if there is a God, He gave us a Torah, and that a few assumptions that it's in our best interest to keep that Torah, I guess.
Right.
Would you make any other assumptions like before we start, just to like?
What are the assumptions? How do we know that it's true? Yeah. So when you're saying how do we know that it's true, you mean how do we know that there was a Torah given by Hashem to the Jewish people, or do you mean how do we know the Torah that we have right now is the same one? Or you're asking both of those things?
Both good questions. Okay. I was asking... 2
different of the 13 principles.
I guess I'm asking, how do we know that the Torah just as
was given?
Yeah, was given. Let's start there.
So,
and why should we keep it? If you can tie those things. If not, we can keep them
I think
separate.
We probably could tie them. The simple answer is that it goes back to what we said about God's existence. Not at the same level, but similar. That the main reason why we believe that the Torah is valid and true is because in any situation of evaluating evidence, we ask ourselves, what is the most likely explanation of the phenomenon that we see? And there's no other religion in the history of mankind that ever claimed that they witnessed divine intervention on a national scale, that they were slaves, downtrodden, lowly slaves, that were liberated from slavery by miracles that everybody saw, and then that God spoke not to one person, not to a prophet who went into a cave like Muhammad, not by somebody who claimed to be the Son of God, but that God actually spoke directly to the entire nation, face to face, so to speak. No other nation has ever made that claim in history. And which means the revelation and the Exodus are not testimony of an individual prophet, but are actually part of the historical record of the Jewish people. And just as we wouldn't doubt the historical records or experiences of any other nation without having to replace them with some other historical narrative out of our own imagination, the most reasonable explanation is that the reason why the Jewish people were able to have this tradition of the Exodus and the Revelation on such a massive scale is because nobody could really ever create such a myth that you can't even get three people to keep a secret long enough to before it unravels. To get millions of people to keep a secret is impossible. Some kind of a conspiracy. Moreover, you would have to explain two other pieces of the puzzle that I always find very intriguing, which is, why is it that this nation, that is the only nation in history that ever claimed that they were, as an entire nation, redeemed from slavery and bondage in a miraculous way that they all saw, and that they were spoken to God directly in a way that millions of them saw, why is this also the only nation on earth that ended up coming up with the idea of monotheism, the idea of the sanctity of human life, the idea of justice and the imperative of justice in society, the idea of anti-idolatry, which didn't exist in the ancient world, the idea of fighting against idolatry, the idea of fighting against superstition and magic, unheard of in the ancient world, the idea of not obsessing over the afterlife, okay, unheard of in the ancient world, the idea of not having human sacrifice, practically unheard of, although they didn't have human sacrifice in Egypt, but it was very rampant. All of these novel ideas just happened to originate, okay, with the same group of people who had the most outlandish story behind their religious revelation, that they were redeemed from Egypt as a people, not as individuals, and that they were spoken to by God as a people. And then to top it off, and so they end up emerging from that experience, which you would think only a bunch of crazies, like what group would ever come up with a mass lie like that? And it happens to be that those mass liars also invented every modern sophisticated idea that we have. Yeah. And on top of that, this same group never even liked their own ideas. Meaning, it was a failed experiment. The Jewish people constantly went after idolatry anyway. They constantly went after magic anyway. They constantly went after stupidity anyway. The book of the Torah is full of critiques of themselves. Right? The book is full of, it's like I jokingly often say, the Tanakh is the most anti-Semitic book ever written. It's full of criticism of Jews from the beginning to the end. And yet this is the book that we pick up and kiss it and love it. And for thousands of years we've held on to this book because we recognize its truth. So there is a lot of reason, and again, can I prove to you the way that I can prove 1 + 1 = 2? Or that the sum of the angles of a triangle is 180, that the Torah was given to the Jews at Har Sinai? No, you could come up with other explanations. I just would say that any explanation that you give is going to have to account for all of those factors, and is going to be a lot less plausible than the explanation that is at face value. And so you'll tell me, yeah, but any explanation that invokes the miraculous and the supernatural is automatically an inferior explanation to mine, which is some kind of you'll give me an alternative explanation that, they evolved it and they did this and that. But why didn't any other nation evolve those ideas? Why didn't any other nation come up with a story like that? Why didn't any other nation bring to the world what the Jewish people brought to the world? To me, the most compelling and plausible explanation is that the Torah is true. And when a person studies the Torah and sees, if a person studies the Torah and sees the level of sophistication of the ideas that is so beyond its time, and you compare it to anything else that originated at that period of time in the world, anything else, it is like light and darkness.
So on that,
there's no other text from that time that people are still studying today as a source of any kind of insight. Maybe there are some religious inspirational texts, but it stands head and shoulders over the religious text of the time.
Right. So about that, like that.
And also, by the way, just one last thing, it's very noteworthy that the other two major religions that emerged out of Judaism were only able to do it by hanging themselves on the coattails of Judaism. Very interesting also. Yeah, they weren't able. Why? Because if JC wants to start a new religion, when everyone knows that this religion has the best evidentiary basis for it because it was a mass revelation? How is he going to be able to start a new movement against that? He can only build on that and say, I'm the fulfillment of it. And what does Muhammad do? The same thing. Why should I believe Muhammad? He went in a cave and came back very sweaty. Maybe he was doing cardiovascular exercise in there. I don't know. I don't want anybody to kill me. Here's this, but he came very in a cold sweat and he had revelations. And by the way, I happen to, and again, this is very controversial. I'm not sure. I happen to think Muhammad did a great service to the Arab world. I happen to think that the Quran has a lot of beautiful passages in it.
That's definitely controversial because he killed a lot of Arab world also and slaughtered a bunch of
I think that he brought he did bad stuff, but he brought a certain level of enlightenment to the Arab world that existed for quite a long time. It's kind of gotten lost, a lot of it, but he stopped them from exposing infants. That they had a lot of. There was a lot of that. He stopped them from idolatry. I think that he contributed good things to the Arab world overall. And I think that a lot of his ideas are very obviously he got them from Judaism. There's literally passages from Midrash Rabbah written in the Quran. Okay, clearly.
Can you give an example?
Off the top of my head, it's towards the beginning of the Quran, but I can't. But there are passages there are stories about, let's say, the Avot that are from the Midrash. Okay, that he puts into the Quran. So he clearly was influenced by by Judaism. He got his fundamental ideas from Judaism, and he realized that any religion not based on Judaism is not going to succeed. And I think that also speaks to the idea that after Judaism, there was really no way to come and say, God revealed to me a new religion. Because Judaism set the bar so high that God revealed the religion to the people. He went directly to the people. He didn't reveal it to a prophet. Of course, then Moshe Rabbeinu receives the rest of it, but not before the Jewish people already saw that God was behind it. Directly saw that. So, and I think that the content also speaks for itself, because you study the Torah and you see the depth and the sophistication of the ideas, and it's just like it's a different world from anything else that existed. Look at the Talmud that we have and how sophisticated and advanced the thinking is in the Talmud. Is there any other religion that sits around and considers the highest religious activity studying these concepts and these ideas in depth? I don't know of any other religion that has that.
Yeah,
so it introduced a totally different level of religious experience.
Yeah, definitely. Going back to looking at the Torah and being and saying, oh, this is the most moral text of its time, right? That there's ideas in there that are so revolutionary and so in line with our morality today that it's persuasive, right? I've heard Sam Harris make the argument that, oh, well, the in the Torah it talks about slavery, right? And you have this idea of that slavery exists within the framework of the Torah. So does that mean that slavery is okay because it's justified from the Bible?
I think there are a lot of things in the Tanakh and also even in the Talmud and even in later rabbinic literature that don't sit well with our morals of today, and that I think that most people who are students of the Torah would even tell you are not compatible with really the underlying ethics and values of the Torah, but are, since the Torah was given and the Tanakh was given in a cultural set in its time. In other words, you have to look at it that way, that it was given at a certain time. Just like if I sometimes use this silly example, but just like if the Jewish people, when they left Egypt, had been in a rush and had brought Pop-Tarts with them instead of matzah, then we would have a mitzvah of eating Pop-Tarts on Pesach instead of eating, I don't know if they're kosher, but whatever, I'm trying to think of quick food, right? So
you're saying it's circumstantial
right.
They had...
So the existence of slavery as an institution predates the Torah. I don't think the Torah likes slavery. I think the Torah tries to control and to limit and to regulate slavery to the point that it eventually will become obsolete. but it's operating within the framework. And actually, there's a rabbi named Rabbi Elchanan Samet who writes a lot of he writes Divrei Torah on the parasha that are fantastic. I have them in Hebrew, but I think you can get them in English on VBM, the virtual Beit Midrash of Gush Etzion. And he has one on slavery where he talks about how slavery was an institution in the ancient world, and basically the economy of the ancient world would not have been able to function without slavery. So therefore the Torah had to gradually try to weed out slavery in various ways, including by, for example, in Parashat Mishpatim. Jewish slavery is one thing, but also even slavery of Gentiles, that if you maim a slave, if you knock out their limb and you have the 24 limbs, then they go free immediately. If you kill a slave, nakom yenakim, the Torah says. Now it's an interesting language, because normally we just say, okay, if the master kills a slave, he should get the death penalty, just like you kill any other person. But it says nakom yenakim, he shall be avenged. There's a sense that the Torah is trying to convey that this is a killing that most people would take lightly because it was only a slave. So the Torah is trying to give a flavor of condemnation to that murder. And if you read, I'm sure that you probably in your travels have read, and maybe some of the audience that's going to watch or listen to this will have read the narrative of Frederick Douglass. And his basically it's a story of his experience as a slave and eventually his finding freedom, and incredibly written book that it's really worthwhile reading if you haven't read it. I would definitely put it up there with one of my favorite books. And he speaks about the horrors of slavery and the murdering of slaves that was for zero reason, and the torturing and the beating and all of the suffering that they inflicted upon them. And he made an interesting observation there. He said that I would rather have a non-religious master. Yeah. Because he said the religious ones were worse. But Judaism is definitely against that idea. That's why it says in Masechet Kiddushin, Hakoneh eved latzmo, kodeh adon latzmo. A person who thinks he's acquiring a slave is really acquiring a master, because you have to take care of your slave, you have to give them. And the Rambam also says in Hilchot Abadim, the Rambam says that you have to treat them with, even though the Torah might give leeway in the way that you discipline or handle slaves, really you have to treat them with chesed and with justice and fairly and kindly and compassionately, because you see that Eov describes how he treated his servants the same as he treated any other member of his household, and this is the right way because they're created in the image of God. And you see that the Torah says on Shabbat you have to let them rest. Like there's a humanizing of the slave that the Torah tries to accomplish, which I believe, and I think that many rabbis believe, including Rabbi Samet says in his essay, was meant to slowly bring about the elimination of the idea of slavery in society, and thank God we don't have it anymore. But similarly, you have child marriage in halakha, which is, I think, very disturbing to many people. Even in the times of the Talmud, talking about the child marriage, and a lot of anti-Semitic websites will quote, the Talmud says having relations with a 3-year-old, having relations with a 5-year-old, fathers marrying off their daughters not without their consent, and all this stuff. Even though all of those things are really contained in the Talmud in theory, they're speaking there about something that they themselves talked about. Anybody who, somebody who marries a child, who marries a young girl is condemned in the Talmud. Even though halachically it's something that is effective, legally it's effective, but where it says anyone who marries off his, or sells his daughter to be a slave is like a horrible, because they would marry them off, like they would make them a servant in the house of someone with the intent that they would marry the boss, or they would marry the boss's son. Right? They weren't really slaves. It was a way to get for poor people to find upward mobility for their daughters, because they wouldn't be able to marry them off to a wealthy family because they weren't wealthy. So they would just marry them to this boss, and they would work for them as a maid, sort of, and they would marry them. So it was slavery, but it was intended for marriage. All of these things the Talmud says, even though they work, and even though there's tons of pages on effectuating these kinds of marriages, it still says you shouldn't do it. So the Gemara distinguishes between institutions that it recognized in society that existed when the Tanakh was given and when the Bible was written and when the Talmud was formulated, and what the real ideals are of Judaism. Really, the ideal of Judaism is against slavery, and the reason why.
Where is this written? Sorry.
In the Talmud, you'll find it.
Do you know where?
In Masachet Kiddushin.
Oh yeah.
I can't tell you a page, but it's there. The Rambam talks about it a lot. These values are values that the Torah Sheba'al Peh teaches you. Listen, this is not really the ideal, even though it might legally be effective on a technicality. It doesn't mean that it's what you should do.
Why do you think the law of the Torah allows for it, even though it understands that this is immoral, right? Is it just that...
Well, I'm not sure I would use the term immoral because I don't know what that term means in anything more than a subjective way most of the time. But slavery is an institution that it can be servitude, in which case it can be a contractual relationship between two people. It could be actual slavery in which a person was kidnapped from their home and stolen into slavery. It can be a brutal institution, and it can be an institution that is that is less brutal. In other words, is it intrinsically immoral that this person works for me and lives on my property, and I have authority over them? I don't know if it's intrinsically immoral, because I think our sense of morality and immorality a lot of times is just intuitive and emotional. It's not like really thought through. So would I call it moral or immoral? I don't know, but would I say it's healthy for society to have a class of people that are subordinated and subjugated to other people? No, I would say that's not good. Definitely not good for the person on the receiving end of it, for their own development and maturity. And the Torah clearly says that a person who opts to be a slave is considered to be bad. Right? Because they're saying, I don't want to be an independent creature, I want to be a dependent creature. And yet the Torah says that a person can keep their Canaanite slaves forever. And a lot of Jewish racists will say, oh, you see from this that enslaving Gentiles is good because it says you're supposed to keep them. And I said to that person who said that to me, that no, the reason why is because the assumption was if you free the Canaanite slave, he's going to go back to his idolatry, he's going to go back to a bad way of life, and he has the opportunity to be part of a Jewish household and to be part of a Jewish life being part of your household, and that's why you keep them there.
So would it be up to him, or he's subjugated to that?
That's why the Torah says you're supposed to keep them. Don't let them go. It also minimizes the amount of slavery, because that way you don't end up getting more, right? So but this person didn't like that answer. But I think that's the reason why the Torah says you should keep the slave is because it's better for them to be in a Jewish household than to be going back to their idolatry.
But shouldn't that be for them to say?
Like what's her name? Like Hagar says, right? It says Hagar was a princess, but she said, I'd rather be a servant in the house of Abraham than be a princess in the house of idolatry. Yeah, the assumption of the Torah is that this idolatrous person probably doesn't know the difference, doesn't know what they're missing, and therefore it's a zechut for them. Would I say that today is true? I don't think I would say that. There's so many ways for people to become educated today, and it doesn't have to be in that way. But in the times of the Torah, if you were where Jewish identity was ethnic, and basically the only way you could have access to those ideas would be being part of a Jewish household, they saw it as a zechut for him to be there, and said keep him there. But and even required you to convert them to Judaism. You weren't allowed to just take a slave. They had to be converted, and they had to keep mitzvot, and there was in a way a positive side to it, that they got to become part of a Jewish family, and they could refuse. Yeah, they could refuse. And what happens? And then eventually you have to let them go.
You let them go.
But the point was that ideally you would bring them in, and they would be a zechut for them. Oh, this is a great lifestyle. I love it. There's this famous story about a rabbi in New Jersey that he had a maintenance guy in his shul for many, many years, and this maintenance guy was just a regular guy, And over the years, over time, he decided he wanted to convert to Judaism from working with the rabbi and working in the shul. And he was so inspired by, he wasn't a slave obviously, but he was so inspired by the rabbi's family and the rabbi and the teachings that he heard and everything that he was exposed to, he wanted to become a Jew, and he became a fully Orthodox Jew. He said, I used to be walking around the shul listening to Howard Stern, the Havdil, you know. I heard he cleaned up his act a little bit, but I don't know.
Yeah,
Not really, I don't know.
I don't follow him.
But I used to walk around listening to that while I was cleaning the floors. Like now I listen to Shirei Torah when I'm working in the shul, and of course they had to find someone else to cover Shabbat because he became Jewish. But the point was like being exposed to positive Jewish role models, and in that context can be great for somebody. Wow, it's wonderful for him. But I don't think the Torah likes slavery because it's not the best way for a person to live as a creature of God. And the people who need to be in a dependent state, we try to encourage them to become independent as much as possible. And a person who really can't, so then some kind of dependent existence is necessary for them. But most people, we encourage them independence. And the same is true with, kiddushay ktana, child marriage and all this stuff. These were things that existed in the ancient world for good reason, because in that social setting it was necessary for girls to get married off early, either for economic reasons or for social reasons or for any number of reasons. Even for that it was considered in their best interest, and our own community, the Mashadi community, had this utilized this mechanism to their own benefit by marrying off the girls young, so they wouldn't be taken by people. So there's some value to that, or setting up a good shidduch for them when they're young, that you don't know what they had all kinds of reasons for why they thought it was good. But even in the times of the Gemara it says you shouldn't do it. So it's like it was something that was there for circumstances, extenuating circumstances in which you needed it. But it wasn't an ideal. Just like somebody becomes an Eved, could decide, I want to be an Eved Olam. I want to be an eternal slave to my master and never leave. Yeah. But we discourage him from doing it. Right? But he could do it.
Even for Eved Ivri, he could do it?
That's an Eved Ivri. The Eved Ivri goes and he puts the hole in his ear.
But that's up to the 7th year. I thought you could only do that until Yovel. And then he
he leaves and the Yovel, but it could be a long time till
right. What was I going to say? I totally forgot my train of thought.
But there's a lot of because the Torah was given in a certain time and place, it has to speak the language and work within the institutions of that time and place. In fact, the Rambam goes so far to say something very controversial, which I don't even know if you would accept this, or maybe a lot of people who are going to listen to this will say this is too much. And a lot of the rabbis in his time said it was too much, including the Ramban and others. But there were some who really liked this idea, that the Rambam says the reason why there are sacrifices in the Torah is only because it was given at a time where that was common. And just like if today you were to tell people there's going to be a religion with no prayers and no rituals, that would be like telling people that there was no sacrifices. They couldn't comprehend that. And so therefore it was, now does that mean that in the Bayit Shlishi, that when we have the Beit HaMikdash back, we're not going to have sacrifices? No, we will. But it will serve a limited function in our society in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, just like in the times of Shlomo HaMelech it only served a limited function. Because Shlomo HaMelech, when King Solomon dedicates the temple, even though the temple we think of as a place of sacrifices, he has a long prayer in the Book of Kings where he dedicates the temple, and not once does he mention sacrifices in the prayer. He only mentions prayer, that this will be a place of prayer for people to come. Wow. Never mentioned sacrifice. So he didn't think, and what does even the very end of the book of Isaiah, Sefer Yeshayahu says, Ki beti bet tefillah yikareh lechol ha'amim. My house will be called a house of prayer. So that was the essential thing, prayer and study of Torah in the Beit HaMikdash. The korbanot served a certain ritual function. So they'll come back. It won't have the same appeal, maybe, to people today as it did back then, because it's not part of our culture today, but we'll appreciate what it's supposed to be symbolizing and representing, and we will have it again.
Would you say the same thing about something like gitin, for example, like ritual divorce, that the man is the one who gives the get, and right, the woman doesn't really give the
social issues? You're getting into the hot button issues here.
Yeah.
But the way that the Torah structures marriage is a transactional way, and it's controversial to say this. I hope I don't have to keep my job much longer after this, because
don't worry,
because I don't know who's gonna hear this, but in a certain way, the Torah is very realistic about the way that it structures relationship. We have a very romanticized concept of what a relationship between a man and a woman is in our society, and it doesn't really translate to the nuts and bolts of the actual relationship. That there's a transactional nature to that. A man, in seeking a wife, is seeking someone to nurture him and is seeking an outlet for his sexual desires. And I'm just being blunt, you know? And a woman is seeking economic security and safety and support.
You would say that this is in their time.
I think that even today there's a lot of truth to it. That's what I'm saying. I think that at the end of the day, okay, if you want, and again, I'm going into like murky waters here.
Yeah, I know.
If you want to get a sense of where people's minds really are at, listen to rap music. Okay, rap music is like all the gloves are off, and you hear what really the drives are. The guys all sing about money. Okay, they all sing about money, and the girls all talk about how they're going to give their bodies for the money.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say that's representative.
I'm not saying it is either, but I'm saying that extreme statement, an extreme statement usually touches upon a reality that's not as extreme, but exists. And so the way the Torah recognized, and I think it was even more so back then, meaning nowadays we have a different idea of a relationship. There's an intellectual relationship between a husband and wife, and there's an emotional relationship, and there's all that. But they didn't have as much of that in the ancient world. It was much more, and you don't have to go back that far. 100 years ago, they didn't have that, okay? It was much more of a practical matter. In Iran, okay, we happen to have, like, in our culture, very, the sense of the sanctity of marriage is very high. And that's very good. But what did most guys look for in a girl? Somebody that they could learn bechavruta with? No, a beautiful woman who was coming from a good family and was going to raise children and keep a house for him. And what did the woman look for? A guy who could provide.
Yeah.
And truthfully, in our culture here, transplanted to Great Neck, the previous generation, at least, I'm not talking about your generation as much, because you guys are more Americanized and more modernized, quote unquote.
Right.
But the parents, if they see the daughter wants to marry a guy who doesn't have a job and he doesn't do this, forget it. And the guy wants a good-looking girl who comes from a good family, that's usually the breakdown. Now, I'm not saying that's all there is, because we live in a culture now where there's so much more to relationships. There's the emotional side. You've got to learn how to communicate.
Yeah.
And I'm like very big into that. I'm not trying to downplay that. I'm just saying the Torah's idea of the relationship between a man and a woman is that the man is acquiring the right to live with the woman, cohabit with the woman, and the woman, in giving that right to the man, is receiving certain guarantees of support and sustenance for her life. Now, that's, in other words, the Torah really looks at marriage as a business transaction in a certain way. It has a holy purpose. That's why there's kiddushin. The kiddushin and the ketubah are the business side. Kiddushin is, when you accept this ring from me, you're saying that you're going to exclusively cohabit with me. Mm-hmm. Now, a man can have more than one wife according to the Torah. Not recommended, even according to the Torah, even according to the Talmud. Not recommended, but possible, because maybe the man wants to have more children or whatever. So, or maybe he's extremely libidinous and he needs more outlets. Mm-hmm. We don't know. But he has to be able to provide for them, because that's the whole point. When you give the ring, the lady is saying, I'm going to cohabit with you. The ketubah, the man writes, to say these are all the things. Now, there are certain biblical obligations that he has automatically to his wife upon the kiddushin anyway. But Shimon ben Shetach required the ketubah, which basically spells out all kinds of other details of it's essentially a prenuptial agreement, the ketubah, that states that he's going to provide her with certain things and what she's bringing into the marriage and what she would bring out in the case of his death or divorce. That's basically what a ketubah is. It's to protect the woman from being thrown out. So that is but the whole point is that that part of marriage is purely business. There's a side which is spiritual, which is the Sheva Brachot. Sheva Brachot reflects the spiritual side of marriage. God created man and woman to be together. He created them in His image. The joy that they have should be a vehicle of service of God, and they should bring, all of the beautiful poetry in the Sheva Brachot and the chuppah. That's all the spiritual side, basically, of the marriage and the connection to God in the marriage. But the kiddushin and the ketubah is really a business transaction. And so, when you look at it that way, if I acquire something, you agreed, I have the right to live with you, exclusive right to live with you. I agree that I'm going to provide X, Y, and Z. So since I gave you the ring and you accepted it and I acquired that right, so I have to give it back to you. How can you how can you now take it back? It doesn't work like that. In other words, since the Torah set it up as a transactional phenomenon, so in which the husband is acquiring something from the wife by giving her something of value, which is how the mechanism works. So in any other acquisition, now it doesn't mean, and this is really, really important because many people misunderstand this. Yeah. The man does not buy the woman, right? It doesn't mean that she doesn't have rights, independence, she can't own stuff, she can't do stuff. It doesn't mean that at all. It means he's acquiring from her the right to cohabit with her. That's really what kiddushin is. I know it sounds very crass, but that's basically what it is. And the woman, in exchange, she receives the kiddushin, it's usually a ring, and she now gets certain rights that she has to claim on him. But since he was the one who acquired the right, he has to give it up. And how does he give it up? Through the get. Now the reason for the get is because, not only because the man acquired a certain proprietary right, you could say, and therefore he has to give it back to her, but also because really the Torah wanted it to be more difficult to get divorced. So that you have to write, it has to be written, so it's more of a process. The person won't in the heat of an argument say, I don't want to live with you anymore, get out, and kick out the wife and put her out on the street. He has to do it in a legal way and with a document, and she also has proof of it, so he can't come and say, what are you talking about? We never had a divorce, you went with some other guy, you're this,
and it also
that.
has to be in a way that she's protected, right?
Well, the fact that it has to be a written document is both a deterrent to divorce in a certain way, because he has to, it's a whole process. You can't just get angry and throw her out like maybe in other cultures they would do. And also, it gives her a document that proves that she's divorced. So he can't come afterwards and say, I never told you were divorced, right? You went and married some other guy. You're an adulteress.
Right.
No, what do you mean? I have the divorce.
There's also like money that he's obligated
he owes her
to give
money.
Yeah.
He owes her money. Biblically he owes her money while they're married. What Shimon ben Shattach did was he added ketubah, which requires additional payments and support after the divorce. He did that because of the problem that many people didn't want to take care of their wives afterwards. Put their ex-wives in bad position. Also because it was supposed to be a deterrent. Because if a man could just divorce his wife with no economic consequences, so then good, it's one less bill I have to pay. And it's her father's problem or whoever.
Yeah.
But this way, no, you're going to have to pay a large amount. Even today that happens. Many couples stay together, for better or for worse, in America, because they can't afford to get divorced. Because the cost of the divorce will be too much.
Wow.
Whether it's the lawyers or it's whatever payments they would have to pay out. Look at what happened to Jeff Bezos. He gave billions of dollars. I mean, to him that's maybe not that much, but even to him, billions is a lot.
Yeah.
Even to him, billions is a lot. So it's not something you want to have to do. So it's one of the cheshbonot. It's one of the considerations. A person gets divorced, so they're going to say, wait a second. Not only do I have to go to a sofer and have him write a get, but I'm going to have to then pay out this and that, and it's complicated. And so a lot of people stay together. Now, the idea is not that people who are in a relationship that's harmful or unhealthy should stay together.
Yeah.
But the idea is that sometimes people will instinctively just want to end a relationship without thinking it through, and this gives them it's a deterrent to rash action.
Right.
So now they'll rethink it. Now that might be in the end that they still want to get divorced, and maybe that in certain cases for certain people is good. That's why the Torah has it. The Torah has it because in certain cases it's good. It's necessary, I should say. It's not good. It's necessary.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that at least the person has to go through a proper process of thinking. And in fact, the halacha is that if a couple that's on their first marriage wants to get divorced, and they come to the Bet Din is supposed to try to stop them, to convince them, to talk them out of it, to get them, maybe you should see a therapist, maybe you should do this. Not in a case of, obviously, where there's serious harm or threat or violence or anything like that.
Right, we're not talking about abuse.
No. We're talking about like where they're not getting along.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I was on the Bet Din in Yerushalayim several years back, and I saw with my own eyes a couple came in, and the rabbi said, "You're not doing a get today." They came in to do the get. He said, "No." He said, "I see the way that you're interacting. You're smiling. You're talking with each other." He said, "You don't need to get divorced. Go back and see if you can work things out. And if you can't, you can come back. But there's still a relationship. You guys should. It's not over. I can see that it's not over."
Did you refer them to therapy, or
I don't know what he did afterwards. It's old school there, but it's very old school. But I thought that was very interesting. And he would also say to couples, if you decide you want to get remarried to each other, and you haven't married anybody else, obviously, in between, I will personally come and I'll do the wedding for you. Like, they tried to encourage people to stay together when they can. Most things, I think, that people get divorced over are things they could probably work out. There's such a high divorce rate that it can't be otherwise. It's just people don't want to focus on the big picture.
Yeah, this is really like a completely different conversation, but I think there's a lot to do with the process, that what people are looking for when they get married, like what they're how they're going about the dating process, like what their like morals are pre-marriage, like
right. But and a lot of times what you're looking for when you're dating might not really be what you feel that you need once you're married.
Yeah.
But it's also more than that our society gives us a, and this is maybe why the previous generation, I'm not saying every marriage in the previous generation was happy, but most of them, almost all of them, stayed together. And the reason why, and most of them seem pretty happy. They're not all perfect, but they seem pretty happy.
Right, to the outside.
Right, to the outside at least.
What's happening.
Yeah. So I think that part of the reason is because expectations play a big role. And so in our society, the expectation is from the movies that you're going to meet this person. Yeah. You're going to marry them. Love at first sight. They live happily ever after and everything is perfect and they're going to solve all of your problems and you're going to just be smiling for the rest of your life. And when that doesn't happen, you have a midlife crisis and you buy a convertible and you marry a girl 20 years younger than you and, the whole thing. This happens very often because people go into it with unrealistic expectations that they learn from the movies. Yeah. And then when it doesn't happen and they start disagreeing and they start seeing that it's not so pleasant, they just want to leave. Because it's a very self-centered type of relationship where the person is just expecting the other person to fulfill this fantasy that they got in their head from the culture around them. Mm-hmm. And when it doesn't happen, they just want out. But it's the older generation had a much more sense that there's an institution of marriage. It's not about the fluctuations of your feelings day by day. It's not that you're going to complete me or I'm going to complete you. It's that we have a job to do. We're creating a family together. We have the same values, and we're ensuring the future of our community, and that's, we have a mission. And I think that was the attitude that they had back then. Much more than what we have today, where it's more like it's about me, and if you're not fulfilling my needs, then I'm going to move on. Yeah.
Did you read the book The River, the Kettle, and the Bird?
I know of the book, but I can't remember.
But he basically speaks about the
by Rabbi Feldman, right?
What's his name?
Feldman, I think.
Maybe I'm sorry, I forgot.
He also wrote The Juggler and the King, another really good book.
Maybe, but he talks about this idea of like there being three different levels to marriage, where the river is that you're working together because you share a similar resource, being the river. The kettle, that you come together, you're two separate entities, but you like the kettle that separates the water and the fire. You're able to work towards a common purpose because of whatever you need to in order to boil the water, whatever you're trying to cook. And the bird is one unified organism that's completely compatible and flies like in unison, and it could walk, and it's the same organism. I think the previous thought process of marriage is a lot more river-like, or at best kettle in that sense. Like okay, fine, we either have to use shared resources, right? Like either economically it makes sense for us to be together, or it's like we're working towards a common purpose, so we just have to stick it out together in order to fulfill that common purpose. And I think definitely I think the consequence of the current process of dating, I didn't even want to talk about dating, but it's just interesting topic, where we learn from mainstream media that you're first gonna be attracted to this woman, and then you're gonna kind of get emotionally attached to her, and then
you're gonna figure out
you're gonna figure it out, and eventually it's just gonna make sense.
Love conquers all.
Happily ever after. And really, I think the approach to dating that we take, at least in modern Jewish society, is really the polar opposite, where first you're really completely focused on the intellectual side. Like, is she going to be a good mother for my kids? Does she have good values? Are we able to communicate?
What kind of family does she
What kind of family does she want? Right? All these things that are very dry and not romantic,
right,
but they're the pillar of your relation. There's the foundation of your relationship.
Right.
And then what tends to happen, if you're with the right person, I could only speak from my experience and experience of people that I've spoken to, but through that process of getting to know that person, right, and realizing their values, you start to develop an emotional relationship. I know for sure that this is what happened to me and my wife, where we start to develop emotionally, and then through that process that we developed an emotional connection, then we had like physical attraction, like that. I wouldn't say I wasn't attracted to my wife before, but like in like a very like I don't not in a vulgar sense. Like I became much more
drawn to her.
Right. I guess that's what you could say, right? And it's really the polar opposite of the modern society. And I think the way that you develop a successful relationship is ideally through that foundation. I think the people who have been dating and aren't married yet, they have the option to be able to do that. And I think it does get harder once you're married, but I think you can build a good foundation even if you didn't necessarily date in that way, if you kind of try and figure that out.
Well, a good paradigm for that is Avraham Avinu picking a wife for Yitzchak. Because how does Eliezer pick the wife for Yitzchak? By seeing who does chesed.
A good example.
And who has good values. And according to the Midrash also, the Midrash reads into certain interactions between them as showing that Rivka was interested in Avraham Avinu's mission and what he stood for and his values, and that was why she wanted to go, and Lavan was only interested in the money, and he looked at the money that Eliezer had, but Rivka was interested in the spiritual side. That's why they were trying to slow it down, but she wanted to go right away. And it says when Yitzchak marries her, it says she came into the tent, and Yitzchak took her as a wife, vayehaveh, and then he loved her. Mm-hmm. So meaning to say that he first saw on the paper that she was like the right match, and then came to really over time have that personal love that created a bond between them, and that's ideal, as opposed to. And here's another controversial thing: some mefarshim who criticize Yaakov Avinu because it says Einei le'ah rakot ve'Rachel hayta yefator v'yefat mar'eh, that he saw Rachel was very beautiful, and then he said, I want to marry Rachel, even though Leah may have been the better match. And therefore Hashem worked it out, Lavan worked it out, but it came to be that Leah was the primary wife of Yaakov, and the one from whom David HaMelech comes, and the one from whom the Levi, Shevet Levi, all the key Shvatim come from Leah. Yosef and Binyamin come from Rachel, but they are secondary, and Rachel doesn't even get to be buried in Marat HaMachpelah. They serve an important function, Yosef and Binyamin, in Jewish history, but the key personalities are from Leah, and Rachel is not even buried in Marat HaMachpelah, which is very interesting. She even took mementos from Lavan, which showed a certain attachment to her father, an attachment to the culture there that she wanted to hold on to. Or maybe she wanted her father to come out and chase her, or whatever it was. I have different theories about that.
Yeah.
But I whatever the case may be, she wasn't seen, I don't think, on the same level as Leah. Not that she wasn't great, but she was willing to leave Lavan behind and go with Yaakov. But it wasn't on the same level as Leah. And Leah was the one who maybe on the surface didn't grab his attention that much, physically or superficially, but values-wise was much more the mature and the maybe the better choice, and he didn't see that.
Do we have evidence in the text for that? Because I would say it seems as though if we look at the results, the major characters of the tribes were all from Leah, and
she's also buried in Marat HaMachpelah, which I think is a big deal.
But you wouldn't say that's more circumstantial? I guess you
no,
wouldn't say that.
because Rachel died before they even got back, and I think it shows that she was not on the same level as the other ones. But I'm not trying to put down Rachel, but I think that there's obviously not. She's still one of the imahot, and she's also very significant in the future of in Jewish history after her, through Yosef and Binyamin, very important. But the fact that the Torah emphasizes that he was attracted to Yifat Torah v'Yifat Mar'eh, and later on we see that what gets Yosef into trouble is he has the good looks of his mom, basically, and therefore he brings upon himself other trouble. And you see that Rachel is she complains, why don't you give me a child? I should die, and she's more. She sounds like the sister who is the younger, prettier one that always got whatever she wanted and all that. I'm not, she has a different, whereas Leah is the one who's the strong character who is able to stand up for herself and endure the challenges of having the problematic relationship with Yaakov. I think you see a greater strength in Leah, and the fact that it emphasizes the looks of Rachel. I'm not saying that on my own. There are some Mefarshim that actually say that. They say, oh, he went after his eyes. He went after the good-looking one. He didn't go after the one that maybe was the best. Wow. And so it worked out better that he ended up married to Leah also.
Wow. It's so interesting because I feel like we always look at it more as like Rachel is the
beloved one. She's the one.
Yeah, right. And Leah is like he just like he happened to be with her.
Yeah, we actually read it as a fairy tale story, which is exactly what it's not. It's trying to show the opposite, that he went after this girl who was the beautiful one, but the one that actually ended up being the core wife was the one that wasn't as beautiful. I'm sure she was also beautiful, but she wasn't the same level.
Wow. We strayed like
we're on a totally different. I have no idea what topic we're supposed to. I can't see the paper.
It's good. Yeah, it's good. But so I guess let's just talk about why we should keep the Torah.
Oh, right. We didn't get to that.
Yeah.
So it's there's a couple of different approaches that you can take to answer that question. Obviously, there's the practical approach, and then there's the more maybe philosophical approach. The practical approach is if you accept and believe the Torah is true and that it obligates you in certain things, that you're part of a covenant with Hashem. You're part of our ancestors made a covenant with God and made a commitment to a mission that was passed to their children, and we inherited that. So there's a sense of obligation that once you recognize it as a true and binding Torah, so it's binding upon you. But I don't think that appeals much to people today. Like the Abarbanel asked the question, how could it be that you can't make a commitment for somebody else? You can't make a oath for somebody else. So how could our ancestors make a commitment to God that my children's children are going to keep this Torah? It's not their power to do that. How could they do that?
It's a good question.
Yeah, and so he has a good answer. He says that. He says that they could, because you benefit from Yetziat Mitzrayim also. Meaning, the fact that you have your freedom and the fact that you have the life that you have is a result of the kindness that God did. Yes, He initially did it to your ancestors, but you inherit that same thing, and that was given in order that you fulfill this purpose.
Yeah, but
that's the answer that He gives. Okay, I'm not saying you have to accept that answer.
No, but
there's another. But that's not the best reason to keep the Torah. I'm just saying.
It's also flawed because Hashem is also the one that put us into Mitzrayim. Right,
but true. But the point is that the Jewish people could have disappeared from the earth, and God brought them out, and therefore He brought them out for a certain purpose, and you're benefiting from the blessings. So you should be committed to the purpose. That's what the Bar Banel says. I think that there's a more basic, obviously there's a more fundamental philosophical reason that the Torah is. Look, if you want to know how to use I have a computer, or I have a telephone, and the computer and the telephone, probably 90% of the functionality of those devices I don't use, because I never read the instruction manual and I don't really understand how they work, and I just open it, and you learn your way by trial and error using any of these devices. And sometimes it will happen that years later someone will say, oh, you can do this with this computer, you can do this with the phone. I never knew you could do that. I've had it for years. I didn't know. But the person who designs something knows best, and they can make an instruction booklet that you can get the best out of it. You could maximize the functionality of what you have. And the purpose of the Torah is to give a person the tools that they can maximize the value of their life as a human being. And most people, unfortunately, choose their lifestyle just based on what everybody else around them is doing, even though the people around them don't really have a good reason for why they're doing what they're doing, and they've never even asked why they're doing what they're doing, and they wouldn't be able to give you a good explanation why, or a justification for why it was the best choice of life.
And
they're just falling into a pattern that was before them.
Yeah, and it's typically very impulsive also, right?
Habitual.
But it's also most people aren't thinking long term with behaviors, right? It's what do I feel good doing right now?
Right. I spoke about that on Shabbat, actually. I was saying that that I asked the crowd, has anybody here ever had really good ice cream? And everyone said yes. I said, no, you haven't. Nobody here has had good ice cream. You had ice cream that tastes good. But you never had good ice cream because it's bad for you. And what feels good is not necessarily what's good. And one of the key things that we have to learn is that sometimes what's actually good and beneficial for us is not what's pleasurable in the short term. A surgeon can cut you open in order to make you healthier. A person can exercise, strenuous exercise, to make themselves stronger. A lot of times in the short term something is painful that in the long term is really beneficial. There's a funny joke about this Rebbe who tells his Hasidim, he says, Rabbi Sai, life is like a cup of tea. And everyone says, wow, the Rebbe said life is like a cup of tea. So every Chassid tells their friend, their grandmother, their cousin, everyone is saying life is like a cup of tea. It spreads all over Europe. It spreads all across the world. Everyone's saying, Rebbe says life is like a cup of tea. They make banners, life is like a cup of tea. They make pamphlets, life is like a cup of tea. They put in every siddur, life is like a cup of tea. Then eventually at the far end of the world, one little guy, Yankala, says, why is life like a cup of tea? What does it mean? Everyone's saying, what does it mean? And so he asks whoever told him, and that guy goes back to the person who told him. He doesn't know either. So that guy goes back to the person who told him. And it traces its way all the way back across the globe again. Let's say you go through thousands of people saying, well, why is it like a cup of tea? We never asked. Why? So they finally get back to the Rebbe. Somebody was in the original court of the Rebbe. And they go up to the Rebbe, and they say, Rebbe, you've told us life is like a cup of tea. We've spread the word life is like a cup of tea. We've put it everywhere, life is like a cup of tea. But we just have one question, Rebbe. Why is life like a cup of tea? And the Rebbe said, okay, so maybe it's not like a cup of tea. I don't know. But the point is that people just accept something, it's a joke, about a person could say something and people take it. Just because somebody's doing something doesn't mean they have a good reason for doing it. And most of our choices, like a person will say, prove to me that I should keep the Torah. I say to them, prove to me that you should live the lifestyle you're living now, and then I'll prove to you you should live the lifestyle I'm living. At least I've thought about why I'm living the lifestyle that I'm living. Most people haven't. So if you say to them, if you can prove to me that the American lifestyle that you're living is the best lifestyle for a human being, actualizes his potential and makes him happiest, I would like to hear it. Because I'm sure, since you're asking me to prove why the way I'm living my life is the best way, you've already thought about and proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that the way you're living your life is the best way, because otherwise you wouldn't be asking me for proof. So show me the proof. Nobody will be able to answer you. Or I should say, almost nobody. I'm sure there's somebody out there who has some sophisticated answer for why. Okay, but 99.9% of people who are going through the motions of American culture, and they go to the school that they're supposed to, and they go to the college they're supposed to, and they get the car that they're supposed to, and the job they're supposed to, and the house they're supposed to, and they raise kids that they're supposed to, and they do everything that they're supposed to, have never sat back and say, what is the purpose of all this? Why is life like a cup of tea? Why did I go to school? Why did I get this job? Why am I raising a family? What's the purpose of it? Just then I die and then it's over. What did I accomplish? And most people don't ask themselves that question. I'm not saying that nobody would have a good answer, but very few people have thought about it, is what I'm saying. I'm not saying every Jew has thought about why Jewish life is good either. Sure. But we should realize that the default, just because something is the default, doesn't mean that it's that it is needs to be disproven. Meaning it hasn't necessarily been proven. Just because it's the default, it's what everybody does.
Yeah.
So just because everybody does it, in fact, I'm always more suspect of what everybody likes and does than what everybody doesn't like and do. Because what everyone likes and does, that means it appeals usually to the lowest common denominator of people. Because if a huge number of people really like something, that usually means it can't be that sophisticated. Because if it was very sophisticated, then a huge number of masses wouldn't be drawn to it, because it doesn't appeal to something low enough for everybody to love it. Like I always quote my professor from college. He said, if I see a book on this is not necessarily always true either, but she said, if I see a book on the bestseller list, I would never read it. Because if that many people like it, it must be stupid. Right? So that, there's some truth to that, okay? There's some truth to it, not always. Now, but that's true about life too. What people are doing, just because they're doing it, doesn't mean that automatically proves it's good. So, but that you could also say that about Judaism.
Right.
So, yeah, but I'm just saying, the whole question, the reason I'm mentioning it is because before you decide that, well, what I'm doing is the default, and if somebody can prove to me to live differently, I might listen, you should also ask yourself, if you're listening to this or you're watching this or whatever, or you, or me, you should ask yourself first, well, what I'm doing now, can I prove that is good? Because maybe it requires a little bit of analysis also. Even if I don't find what somebody else tries to convince me of as being very compelling, does that automatically mean what I've been doing up till now is a proven approach? Not necessarily. The question is whether people, in other words, does the living of the American dream bring happiness? And why or why not? And to my mind, it can't, because, and the proof to my mind is,
it can't, or it's unlikely to.
It can't, because it only addresses a small part of what a human being is. Which is the physical, emotional part. It doesn't address the spiritual, intellectual part of a person. And the essence of what makes you different from all of the other animals on earth is that you have a mind and a soul that is human. If you're not engaged with that mind and soul, you can't be complete. And a person is only happy when they're complete. So my evidence for that is that you see that the people that we would most expect to be the happiest are miserable, or at the very least, not as happy as we would expect them to be. Look at the best example is the celebrities that make it big when they're very young. Celebrities, I feel the worst for the celebrities that make it big when they're very young, because whenever I see that, I'm just waiting for the news report that they committed suicide or they're in a rehab center. Why does that happen? because for the rest of us who never achieve fame and fortune, we never have to confront the reality that it doesn't completely fill the void in our soul. We never have to confront that. So we just keep thinking, if only I had all that money, and if only I had that fame, I would be so happy, and I would just sit around basking in that every day, sitting in my boat by the, fishing or golfing, whatever the dream. But the person who gets there and realizes that it doesn't give them what they thought it was going to give them, that's much worse. Because for the average person who never reaches it, they can always use it as a motivation to keep working and to keep striving, because one day I might have that American dream.
Right.
But for the person who gets there early and realizes that the fame and the money and the unlimited pleasures, you can keep trying to vary the pleasures, and you can keep trying. It gets boring after a while, and you're not fulfilled, and you realize that this was all just a dream. You don't have anything more to go for now. You don't have anything higher to go for now. You got there and it didn't give you what you thought it was going to give you. And so what happens is they recede into drugs, they recede into drinking, they do other terrible things. And it's really tragic for them. It's almost better, in that case, ignorance is bliss, because the person who fantasizes that these achievements will bring them great happiness can at least have a reason to go on and get up in the morning because they think that it's going to happen for them. But a real happiness has to address the totality of what a human being is.
Right. To be fair, there are other frameworks that also seek to engage the soul as well as the body. Like off the top of my head, like Buddhism, right? Their whole thing is meditate. I don't know a lot about Buddhism, but like. The whole concept, to my knowledge, of meditation is that you're engaging the soul. Mm-hmm. So how do we know that Judaism's way of engaging the soul is superior to Buddhism's, or even an American mindfulness educator or whatever?
Well, I think a person who is involved with any kind of inner growth type of lifestyle will be happier than a person who is just involved with the physical, emotional stimulation and a constant searching for that. I wouldn't doubt that those people are happier. Mm-hmm. I think that a person who is an intellectual, who is, a voracious reader, who loves to learn new things, somebody who's an artist, people who are involved in more transcendent goals and are engaged with purpose that is higher than the momentary pleasures, those people are going to be, of course, happier, because the attempt to focus on my momentary emotional or physical pleasures as the goal of my life is bound to be frustrating. But when a person is dedicated to some higher objective that brings them out of their momentary life, that's actually when they reach the greatest happiness, because they are serving something that is higher than themselves, and they're engaging with something greater than themselves. Because when we get involved with our own momentary pleasures, what's very small becomes very big to us, because any little frustration is intolerable, and lack of stimulation becomes boredom, and the need for more stimulation becomes, a constant frustration. Whereas when the person is involved in higher-minded activities, so that person isn't so concerned about the moment-by-moment pleasure and pain, because they're engaged with something so much greater and more exciting than that. Now, we have in Judaism mitzvot and Torah that we learn and that we practice that are constantly engaging our mind and constantly deepening our understanding and making us think. And that's what Ahavat Hashem is. Ahavat Hashem is love of God, means that the person's mind is fully given over to the majestic wisdom of Hashem that we see in the Torah and that we're seeking after. And we want to structure our life after those experiences of closeness to God and ways that we can implement God's wisdom in our life, and the challenge of doing that. It's an ongoing mission. So because we have this higher purpose, we're able actually to let go of the petty things more easily, because and let go of the momentary frustrations more easily, because we're engaged with something higher. And I think that that's something that a person who's involved in any kind of a higher quest or purpose can have a similar satisfaction in life. Just that Judaism offers us a systematic program for that. It's designed with a human being's potential in mind to help us fulfill and actualize our potential in a systematic way. And there's no other program that's really designed to do that, from youngest age up to the day that you die, mapping out your life to make sure that it is a purposeful life and an engaged life that not only, and actually in its restricting of our bodily pleasures, it makes those pleasures better. It requires us to be disciplined in the bodily pleasures so we don't get bored with them or frustrated with them or overindulgent in them and then end up causing ourselves greater harm by either becoming addicted to them or becoming, and chasing after them, or letting them take over our lives in other ways. So actually the discipline and the control and being able to say, okay, kashrut, or things that,
Nida.
Laws that,
Nida.
Yeah, laws that regulate sexual behavior, laws that regulate business practices. We can't cheat, so therefore we have to have a proper perspective on money and material things also, and respect of other people's property. All of these things, pretty much the rule of thumb is that anything that the Torah places a restriction on is not an end in its own right. Because whatever the end in its own right is unlimited and infinite for a person. But whatever is not the ultimate needs to be limited so that you can make way for the things that are infinite. And so eating and drinking should not be the be-all and end-all of life. So there are certain restrictions and limitations. Work should not be the be-all and end-all of life. So there are restrictions and limitations. Sexual behavior should not be. But certain things are, like chesed is unlimited. Kindness is unlimited. Right? Gmilut chasadim. Elu dvarim she'en lehem shiur, right? Ha-pe'ah ba'bikurim, pe'ah is leaving charity. Right? And v'talmud Torah, learning. There's no time a person says, I know everything already. I don't have to learn. So there are areas where the Torah never places a limit. Obviously, you're not allowed to impoverish yourself in helping other people, because it's self-defeating, because now you need somebody else to give you charity. Yeah. It's stupid. Right? But kindness and is unlimited, and learning is unlimited. So there's never a restriction. So anything that needs to be put in context and balanced is something that the Torah places a restriction on, so that we won't allow it to cloud our vision or take over our life. Anything that the Torah says put your full energy into, it means that it's infinite. And what a person comes to realize, and this is what the Rambam speaks about, especially when he talks about Ahavat Hashem, but interestingly, many of the philosophers talked about it. We mentioned Spinoza before, he talked about it. Aristotle talked about it. And many great scientists, including Einstein, to come back to him again, spoke about it too. That when a person gets involved in the process of discovery, could be the process of discovery of himself through the lens of Torah that helps us to understand ourselves better, could be through the process of discovery of the beauty of the mitzvot, of the beauty of the Torah, of the beauty of God's handiwork in nature, anything. The more they become absorbed, it becomes an addiction, but it becomes an addiction that's actually uplifting instead of deadening, because the person is constantly seeking new insight and is constantly energized by the quest for greater understanding, instead of physical pleasures that we chase after, and then as soon as they're over, they kind of leave you with not much to hold on to, just a nagging feeling that you need something else or you need more variety. The beauty of discovery is that it constantly fuels your joy in life. Life is an adventure. I feel like Judaism structures life as an adventure. Everything is a mitzvah. Everything has a way that an idea in Torah can illuminate it. Like any interaction you have, you can reflect on it through some story in the Torah or some concept in a mitzvah, and it illuminates your life. So your life becomes a series of like thought adventures, and it makes life that much more meaningful when it's lived in that engaged way. I think that's really what the Torah, that's why it says Asher Kedishanu b'mitzvotav, that Hashem sanctified us with the mitzvot. Sanctified means to transcend. You don't get caught up in the moment by moment because you're living on a higher plane. You're thinking of things that are beyond. And the difference between a person who, very simply, you can see a movie. And one person will just see a movie and either it made them feel good or it made them feel bad. But a person who is a thinking person takes that movie and says, what was really the message of that movie? What were the ideas in that movie? Do I agree with them? And sometimes you might feel okay about a movie, but then once you kind of break it down and analyze it, you're like, you know what? I don't like that movie. It had a bad message. But the very fact that you sit back and think about it is what differentiates Asher Kedishanu b'mitzvotav, somebody who's living on a higher plane, from somebody who's just living in the moment and just taking experiences in, and then let's go see another movie, let's watch another show. Wait, what was this really about? I remember once I went to see Les Mis with my wife, and on the way back from seeing it, I got it for her for some birthday or something, tickets, I don't remember. On the way back, I said, you know, Les Mis is really like a very anti-Jewish story. It's a Christian story. Because it's about how the law is evil. I don't know if you know the story of Les Mis.
No, I didn't watch it.
Yeah, it's about how the law is portrayed as very negative, and grace and that is. And she said, "Now you ruined the show. Why'd you have to tell me that? You ruined it now." Right? I said, "Yeah, but that's clearly like what the message is. The same as the Merchant of Venice and Shakespeare. Socher Venezia. I remember we had it in Hebrew in my high school." But the same idea that the Jew is viewed as this very, I want my pound of flesh, I want my money. You know, it's very narrow-minded and legalistic. And the Christian is giving and generous. Anti-law, pro-grace. You know, disregarding the law. Now, these have to be balanced. But the point is that every show, every book, every movie conveys certain values. And to be able to reflect on them, to be able to reflect on your experiences. Wow, that was fun. What made it fun? What was it about it that made it fun? That's the difference between a thinking person. Like I often say, if I go to an event and they have a speaker and the speaker's boring, to me, it's subjective. But I see everyone else is having a good time, I will say, this speaker is boring, but I'm going to spend the time trying to figure out why everyone else thinks it's interesting. And I'll try to figure out what it is. So it becomes an opportunity to think. What the Torah does is, that's why Talmud Torah is constant, because it's not just thinking, we think of learning of Torah as sitting in front of a book, but it's actually a way of thinking about everything in life. It shapes the way you think about everything in life. And it makes and the mitzvot challenge you all the time to think about things. Oh, I want to do this, but the halakha says I can't. Why does it say I can't? What's the reason why it says I can't? Now that makes me think about why I wanted to do it to begin with. Oh, it's trying to show me not to. Like, for example, the Torah says you can't bear a grudge against somebody. What does that mean? You can't take revenge on somebody. If they refuse to lend you something and then they ask you to lend them, you have to give it to them. You can't take, that's called revenge if you refuse. But it says you can't bear a grudge. What does that mean? It means, let's say you went to borrow the guy's lawnmower and he said no. Now the guy comes to your house and says, can I borrow your shovel? And you say, you give him the shovel.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you the shovel. You are a jerk, but I am a nice guy. So I'm going to give you the shovel. Right? So what did you just do there? That's called bearing a grudge, meaning it's still on your mind. What did you do there? Why do you want to do that? Why do you want that? Because you want to use the giving of the shovel as a way to get back at him. You're really making the giving of a shovel into an act of revenge, because you're saying this act of revenge shows that I'm superior to you. You made me feel bad about myself by not wanting to help me. I'm going to reassert that I am superior to you by giving you the shovel. So it might seem like I'm helping you and being your friend, but actually I'm slamming you down by giving it to you because I'm showing that I'm better than you. See, and that was, I want to settle the score. Right? You think about it and say, wow, the Torah has such an insight into what makes us tick, that it realizes that people will take revenge, but there's another way that people take revenge where they actually pretend like they're doing something nice, but actually the objective is the same as revenge. It's to put the person back in their place by helping them, but helping them in a way that satisfies my desire for revenge. So it just gives you another. All the mitzvot are like that. Why do we put tefillin? I was just talking about a bar mitzvah today. Why do we put tefillin? Tefillin is jewelry. Totefot is totefet is a jewelry. What does it mean to put jewelry on? What do you put on yourself? What does a person put on as jewelry? Whatever they think is the most valuable thing. Whatever they think is the most beautiful thing, they put as jewelry. What do we put as our jewelry? The words of Hashem. Divrei Torah. We put the words of Torah on our body to say, this is my jewelry, this is my crown, this is what I'm proud of, this is what makes me special, not gold and diamonds and all that. Divrei Torah. Right? So it makes you think, wow, that's how I should be relating to the Torah and the mitzvot, as something that is a jewel, something that is jewelry, that I wear in that way. It makes you understand. So everything, or tzitzit. What is tzitzit? Tzitzit is that your garment shows your identity. Your garment is part of your identity. The clothes make the man. It shows who you are. When you have tzitzit, it reminds you what your real identity is. Your real identity as a servant of God. Your real identity as a member of the Jewish people. That's why it's connected to remembering the Exodus from Egypt. You're not an Egyptian. You're part of the Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. You're part of a holy nation. You take a garment. A garment is not just something that protects your physical body, but it's actually something that expresses who you are to the world and to yourself. When a soldier wears a uniform, they feel differently. Right? You feel differently. You realize you're something more than just your individuality. That's what the tzitzit does. When you think about how the Torah makes you think about what the function is of clothing, what the function is of jewelry, how I relate to my food, how I relate to my spouse, my children, it makes everything a reason to think. It makes a person think about everything. You might say, well, that will drive me crazy. Yeah, maybe sometimes, but not as much as it will make you crazy to not think and try to be happy that way. So it makes life an adventure that engages the mind constantly. And I think what other religions that involve the mind, or Buddhism, I don't know much about Buddhism either, but what's different is that it's not really meditation as much as active engagement, and it's a structure of life that, like, I'll read the same prayers, we all read the same prayers every single day, and I'll constantly discover things in the tefillah that I never noticed before. And if we didn't have those tefillot, those prayers structured for us, I wouldn't have chanced upon that idea or that insight. So I feel like there's so much to engage us at every level and to balance who we are. And that's the benefit of Judaism. The benefit of Judaism is to have a purpose-driven life, that you have a sense of your heart, your soul, your body, everything is balanced and is engaged fully, and you're living your life for a higher purpose to relate to God at the highest level that you can, which involves not only thinking, obviously, but also doing what you do and how you bring those values to bear in the world. So it changes your whole attitude and your whole orientation to life, and that brings real happiness, because it's actually the release from your preoccupation with individuality and with with the petty things that brings happiness. And that's why they said, like, you could find a person who left behind a life of physical pleasures to pursue a life of thought, but you never really find a person who pursues a life of thought who gives it up to go back to the physical pleasures. Because the person who's a thinking person ends up realizing that the physical pleasures don't really provide you satisfaction, and in his world of thought, he has constant stimulation and interest that he's able to pursue. So he's in a much better position. He wouldn't want to go back to the place that he was before. I remember a guy that I knew who went off the derech for a while. He ended up coming back. He said, I wasn't an interesting heretic because I was a thinking heretic. So I didn't even I couldn't enjoy the pleasures of this world. Like, I didn't have olam haba or olam hazeh. Because in olam haba, I left Judaism. And olam hazeh, I knew that it was all meaningless. Like, I learned. That he got. He saw that it doesn't really give people happiness. So he couldn't be happy as a heretic either. He ended up coming back. So, these things happen. I think he became a rabbi.
Really?
I think so, yeah.
That's an interesting story.
Yeah, I knew him a long time ago. I wonder what happened to him. I'm not sure.
Kind of an interesting question, though. By the way, I don't know how much time you have.
I don't even know what time it is.
8:15 almost.
It is? Oh, wow.
We spend a lot of time.
Yeah.
We could start winding down soon.
Yeah, because I have to come back for my women's class soon.
9 o'clock, right?
Yeah.
All
And
right.
I have to jump home first.
But just because you mentioned like happiness a few times, and I think it's probably one of the most important metrics. But just to clarify, is that seen as the most important metric from the Jewish perspective? Happiness, right? Like our goal is to ultimately be happy people.
Yes.
Is that a truth?
Yes. The Torah says in many places. In fact, it's in this week's parasha. V'samachta lifnei Hashem Elohecha.
Right, but that
and it says when is Hashem going to punish you? Tachat asher lo avadta et Hashem Elohecha b'simcha u'v'tuv lev. Hashem is going to, because you didn't serve God with joy and a good heart. And the Rambam says in the end of Hilchot Sukkah, he says, the simcha that a person has in doing the mitzvot and in learning Torah and serving God, he says, this is a great service. This is the highest service of all. Because the simcha that a person has, simcha means getting fully engaged with all of your energies in something beyond yourself. That's real joy. We confuse joy with pleasure a lot of times. Pleasure is internally directed, but so is sadness internally directed. When you're sad, you can't enjoy anything going on around you because you're too preoccupied with your own sadness, with your own troubles, with what you're missing. You know? When you're angry, actually, that's why Mishlei we learned in Israel, in Kohelet, it says anger is better than... the anger is better because at least if you're angry, you're engaged with the outside world. Mm-hmm. When you're sad, you're absorbed inside. But joy means that you're rising above yourself. And simcha is when a person is fully engaged with something beyond the self. That's real simcha. That's not pleasure. It's happiness. Happiness is fully engaged with a purpose that lifts you above the smallness of your existence, basically, that gives purpose to your existence. That's the difference. That's why a person can be in pleasure or in pain, but happy in both cases. Because a person might be having momentary pleasure or momentary pain, but their happiness is a state of mind, that they have a sense that their life has purpose and meaning. And that's what gives them a sense of fulfillment, that they're actualizing their potential. And they reflect on that. That's real joy. And that's why the Rambam says it's a great service to have joy, meaning that a person can say, no, I'm not willing to devote my energies to something outside myself. I'm not willing to fully dance and get, fully wrapped up in my love of God and give myself over to it, or my love of mitzvot, or my chesed, or whatever that driving force. I'm not willing to do it. I'm withholding myself. That's why the famous story, David HaMelech is dancing crazily before the Aron, and his wife Michal says, Melech Israel. She's being sarcastic. Oh, look how honorable you are. You dance like an idiot in front of all of the servants, and you lower yourself. And what did David HaMelech say? He said, no, I would do even more and lower myself even more. And you know what? The people will honor me more for that. Meaning I was so wrapped up in my service of God, it didn't matter to me what anybody thought. And you know what? That's what people see as real greatness. Real greatness is when the person isn't worried about what everyone else is thinking. They're fully given over to what they're doing. And it's something higher than themselves. That's real happiness. The more you're involved with yourself, the less you're able to be happy. Wow. Because that's small things. When you're involved with something big, something great, it's ennobling, and that's really what gives a person joy. And anyone who experiences that will see that that's the case. The happiest people are the people who are devoted to causes greater than themselves.
Wow. I could go on for another 4 hours, but I think that was honestly the perfect ending. Yeah. So we could stop here, and hopefully if this was of interest to other people, and obviously if Rabbi, you have more time, I'd love to discuss the other questions.
Sure, save the paper for next time.
Yeah, I'm going to save it.
This was a fun discussion.
Much. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you guys enjoy it, just let me know. If you guys have any questions that you would want me to discuss in the future, just let me know. That would be great. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thanks, Harry.
Thank you. It was fun. It was good.
I really enjoyed it.
Lots to think about.
You know, I was saying, if nothing else, the fact that I got to sit down with you right now for 2 hours.
And it wasn't at a wedding.
Yeah. I told you, I'm like, the best part is that I get to sit with the rabbi and just